Being human is a contradiction. Everything you think makes sense doesn't. These are the 50 paradoxes baked into your mind. Don't expect comfort, just truth. The hedonic treadmill. You finally get the thing you wanted. A raise, a new phone, a vacation, a relationship. For a while, it feels amazing. You're proud, grateful, excited. But then, the feeling fades. What was once a huge achievement becomes normal. The thrill wears off. You start looking for the next thing. That's the hedonic treadmill. The idea that no matter how much your life improves, your happiness tends to return to a baseline. You keep running toward more, but emotionally, you're staying in place. Let's dig into the psychology. The term hedonic treadmill was coined in the 1970s by psychologists Brickman and Campbell. They found that people adapt surprisingly fast to positive and negative changes. Whether you win the lottery or experience a major injury, your happiness spikes or dips temporarily, then gradually returns to your personal average. This doesn't mean events don't affect you. It just means your emotional system recalibrates. You get used to things. This is called hedonic adaptation. It is a survival feature. If you stayed euphoric every time you bought new shoes or had a good day at work, you'd never focus on the next task. Your brain was built to stabilize. But in a modern world, that stabilization becomes frustrating because you now live in a culture of constant upgrade. Every ad, every social feed, every metric tells you there's something better, a better version of you, a better product, a better lifestyle. And so you chase. You think, if I just had that new job, that new body, that new apartment, then I'd finally feel good. And maybe you do, briefly. But then your brain adapts. The new car becomes your normal car. The bigger house becomes your regular house. The person you once dreamed of becomes part of your routine. And that initial surge of joy fades. So you look for the next fix. You stay on the treadmill. And here's the trap. You think you're making progress because you're moving, but emotionally, you're stuck in place. Now, this doesn't mean you should never pursue goals. Progress still matters. Growth is still fulfilling. The problem isn't ambition. It's the belief that the next thing will finally make you happy forever, because it won't. Happiness doesn't live at the top of the next hill. It lives in how you relate to the climb. So, how do you get off the treadmill? You shift your strategy. Instead of chasing intensity, you invest in sustainability. Instead of seeking highs, you build habits that support steady well-being. This means things like gratitude practice, because noticing what you already have slows adaptation. Mindfulness, because presence disrupts the need to chase. Strong relationships, because connection provides deep, lasting joy. Purposeful work, because meaning lasts longer than novelty. Volunteering or helping others, because external focus balances internal craving. And sometimes, it just means stopping, stepping back, sitting with the discomfort of not reaching for the next thing, and realizing you're still okay. Because happiness isn't about constant elevation, it's about emotional range, stability, and knowing that joy doesn't require constant stimulation. That's the paradox. You run faster, upgrade more, achieve higher, and yet your happiness barely moves. The treadmill doesn't stop on its own. You have to choose to step off. The paradox of social media. You open your phone to feel connected, to check in, to see what people are doing, to feel less alone, and for a moment, it works. You scroll, you laugh, you like, you see faces, reactions, lives, but then quietly, almost without noticing, something shifts. You start comparing, you feel behind, you feel less interesting, less attractive, less successful. You close the app, you're lonelier than before. That's the paradox of social media. The tools designed to connect us often make us feel more isolated. It seems backwards. Social media was supposed to bring us together, and in some ways it did. You can stay in touch with people across the world, find communities, share your thoughts instantly, post a photo and get feedback in seconds. But that constant exposure to everyone's best moments, filtered faces, curated wins, it warps your perception. You start comparing your full, messy, behind-the-scenes life to someone else's highlight reel. And no matter how well you're doing, you feel like you're falling short. This is known in psychology as social comparison theory. It's not new. We've always compared ourselves to others. But social media amplifies it. You're not just comparing to your neighbors or co-workers. You're comparing to influencers, celebrities, strangers, people who post the perfect vacation, perfect body, perfect lifestyle every day. Even if you know it's curated, your brain still absorbs the message, you're not enough. Everyone else is doing better. And here's the paradox within the paradox. The more disconnected you feel, the more you scroll, looking for a sense of belonging. But the longer you scroll, the worse you feel. It becomes a feedback loop. You feel lonelier, you scroll. You see filtered lives. You compare. You feel worse. You scroll more. You engage less deeply in real life. You feel even lonelier, and the cycle continues. This has real consequences. Studies have linked heavy social media use to increased rates of anxiety and depression, decreased self-esteem, disrupted sleep, body image issues, feelings of isolation, especially in teens and young adults. Ironically, the platforms that promise connection can leave you more fragmented, be more like an observer of life than a participant in it. Now, not all social media is harmful. It depends how you use it. Are you engaging with people you know? Are you using it to create, to laugh, to connect with shared interests? Or are you passively consuming, puffing, comparing, doom scrolling, spiraling into jealousy or numbness? That difference matters, because social media isn't evil, but it's not neutral either. It's designed to hold your attention, not protect your well-being. And without intentional use, it starts shaping how you see yourself, your worth, and the world. The paradox of choice fatigue. You wake up, and the choices begin. What to wear, what to eat, which message to reply to, which task to start, which notification deserves your attention first. Then it's what to listen to, what to watch, what to cook, what to post, which email to ignore. By the end of the day, you're exhausted, not from physical effort, but from the mental load of choosing. That's the paradox of choice fatigue. The more options you have, the more freedom you feel, until it becomes overwhelming and you shut down. We love having choices. It feels like power, and in a lot of ways, it is. Being able to choose your job, your lifestyle, your relationships, your beliefs, that's a privilege many people throughout history didn't have. But too many choices. That's a different kind of problem. Psychologist Barry Schwartz famously called this the paradox of choice. He found that when people are given too many options, they don't feel more satisfied. They feel more anxious, more doubtful, and more likely to regret whatever they picked. Because when everything is possible, nothing feels right. You second guess. You wonder what you're missing. You feel like there must have been a better option, and that you made the wrong one. This leads to decision fatigue, a condition where your brain gets tired from making too many decisions in a row. Studies show that the more choices you make in a day, even small ones, the harder it becomes to make good ones later. That's why CEOs wear the same outfit every day. Why athletes eat the same breakfast. Why routines matter. It's not laziness, it's mental preservation. Because once your decision battery runs low, you avoid decisions altogether. Choose impulsively, or stick with whatever's easiest, not what's best. In other words, the more power you have to choose, the more effort it takes to use that power wisely. And in the digital age, that power is endless. You can scroll past thousands of songs, thousands of videos, thousands of people, but you can only meaningfully engage with a few. And when everything is one tap away, you start to feel like you're always choosing, but never committing. You date, but don't connect. You browse, but don't buy. You dabble, but don't dive deep. You trade freedom for saturation and end up overstimulated, underwhelmed, and exhausted. So what's the way out? You limit your choices on purpose. You create structure. You commit to fewer things. You simplify what you can. So you have energy for what matters. Choose your top 3 priorities, not 15. Stick to a meal rotation, not 100 recipes. Use a playlist, not infinite shuffle. Build daily routines that reduce low-value decisions. Learn to say no, not because you're rude, but because you value your focus. And perhaps most importantly, let go of the belief that there's always a perfect choice. Most of the time there isn't. There's just a good enough choice, and what matters more is what you do with it. Because freedom isn't just about having options, it's about having the clarity and courage to choose and move forward. You don't need every door open, you just need to walk through one. The paradox of efficiency. Efficiency sounds like a good thing. Get more done. Save time. Optimize. Work smarter, not harder. Right. So we automate. We streamline. We create systems, apps, tools, workflows, all to do things faster and better. But here's the twist. The more efficient you become, the more you're expected to do. And instead of having more free time, you often end up with less. That's the paradox of efficiency. The better we get at saving time, the more we fill that time with even more work. Let's look at how this plays out. Think about email. In the early days, it was revolutionary, faster than letters, easier than phone calls. It was supposed to save time, but now we drown in emails. Inbox zero is a fantasy. As soon as you reply to one, 3 more show up. And because email is so fast, people expect fast responses. Urgency becomes the norm. Same with messaging apps. You can send a Slack message instantly, but now you're expected to reply instantly too. You've made communication more efficient and accidentally turned it into a never-ending stream of micro-demands. This pattern shows up everywhere. You get a faster laptop, so now you're expected to run more tabs, handle more meetings, do more multitasking. You learn how to write code faster, so now your manager gives you more tickets, tighter deadlines. Efficiency doesn't buy you relief, it raises the bar. Psychologists call this the efficiency trap. It's when improvements in productivity lead not to rest, but to higher expectations. Instead of freeing you, efficiency makes you busier. And it's not just a personal problem, it's systemic. In economics, there's a similar concept, Jevons paradox. It says when technology makes something more efficient, we don't use less of it, we often use more. For example, cars became more fuel efficient, but instead of driving less, people drove more because it cost less to do so. The result? Higher total fuel use. Same principle applies to your time. You make a task take 30 minutes instead of 60. Great. Now you're assigned 2 tasks in the same hour. Efficiency doesn't reduce workload. It often increases it. But here's where the paradox gets personal. You start to believe that if you're not producing, you're wasting time. That being idle is lazy. That rest is indulgent. You stop asking, what matters? And only ask, how fast can I get it done? And before you know it, you've become incredibly efficient at doing things you don't even care about. So what's the solution? Not to reject efficiency, but to be clear about what it's for. Efficiency should be in service of values, not just output. It should create space for things that matter: rest, relationships, creativity, reflection. But unless you guard that space, that will get filled. You have to choose not just to do more, but to do less, better. You have to be okay with not squeezing every second for output. Efficiency promises freedom, but without boundaries. It only makes you a faster hamster on the same wheel. 2 envelopes paradox. You're handed 2 sealed envelopes. You're told that one of them contains exactly twice as much money as the other. You choose one, say, the envelope in your left hand. But before you open it, you're given the option to switch. You think, if this envelope has, say, $50, the other might have $100. But if this one only has $25, then the other would have $50. Either way, the other envelope has a 50% chance of being double what I have now. So switching seems like a smart move. So you switch. Then you go through the same reasoning again, and you want to switch back, and again. This is the two envelopes paradox, a scenario that traps you in an infinite loop of second guessing, where switching always seems like the better option, even when it isn't. It feels like a math problem, but underneath it reveals something deeper, how easily logic can be distorted when uncertainty meets desire. Let's break it down. You start with two envelopes. One has an unknown amount. Let's call it x. You reason that the other envelope could either contain 2 times x or 1/2 of x. So you calculate the expected value like this: a 50% chance of 2 times x plus a 50% chance of 1/2 x. That becomes 0.5 multiplied by 2x plus 0.5 multiplied by 1/2 x, which simplifies to x plus 1/4 x, or in total 1.25 x. Suddenly, it seems like switching gives you 25% more value on average. That sounds great, except it's completely wrong. Here's why. That x, it's not a fixed value. It's whatever's in the envelope you already chose. You're using that variable as both a known amount and an unknown one at the same time. It's a subtle mathematical error, but it makes a huge difference. It creates the illusion that switching is always better, when in fact, both envelopes have an equal expected value. You're just trading one unknown for another. But most people don't notice that. What they feel is this: there might be more in the other envelope, and that's enough to make them switch. Then switch again. Then doubt every decision. That's the emotional layer of the paradox. The desire to maximize gain, combined with the uncertainty of not knowing, creates a loop of second guessing. You tell yourself you're being rational, but really, you're just afraid of missing out. It's the same feeling people get when they sell stocks too early or too late, or keep checking Zillow even after buying a house. It's a fear-driven loop, and paradoxically, the smarter you try to be, the more you calculate your way out of it, the deeper you fall into it. This is where the two envelopes paradox becomes more than a puzzle. It reflects a common flaw in human decision-making, the belief that there must always be a better option, and that we can always find it if we just think harder. But that's not how life works. In many real-world scenarios, relationships, careers, investments, you don't get to open both envelopes. You don't get to test every alternate life path. And the more time you spend switching, the less you actually live with any choice at all. The lesson isn't to never switch, it's to understand why you want to. Are you acting on information or just anxiety? Because if your decisions are driven by imagined losses rather than actual evidence, you'll never feel satisfied. You'll just keep switching. The two envelopes paradox isn't really about envelopes. It's about the human brain and how easily we confuse indecision with intelligence. The attention economy paradox. You wake up and check your phone. Maybe just for a minute. 20 minutes later, you've scrolled through news, memes, notifications, comments, and you're already tired. Not because you did too much, but because your attention was hijacked. That's the attention economy paradox. You live in a world that constantly fights for your attention, and the more information you consume, the harder it becomes to focus on anything at all. Let's unpack this. Attention is no longer just a personal resource, it's a product. Tech companies don't just want you to use their apps, they want you to stay there, because the longer you scroll, watch, or click, the more ads they can show you, the more data they can collect, the more money they make. So they build systems designed to exploit your brain's reward centers: infinite scroll, notifications, autoplay, algorithms that learn what keeps you hooked. And they work really well. You find yourself bouncing from TikTok to Twitter to YouTube to news feeds, but at the end, you barely remember what you saw. You've consumed a ton of content, but retained almost nothing. This leads to cognitive fatigue, a state where your brain is overloaded with stimulation, but starved of depth. It feels like burnout, but it's not from overworking, it's from over-processing noise. You feel distracted all the time. You can't finish a thought before your brain jumps to something else. Even simple tasks feel harder, not because you're lazy, but because your attention is constantly fragmented. And here's the real kicker. The more distracted you feel, the more you seek easy content to self-soothe. Scrolling becomes both the cause and the temporary escape from mental overload. It's a loop, and most people don't realize they're stuck in it. That's what makes it a paradox. You crave information, but drown in it. You crave stimulation, but feel numb. You want to focus, but can't stop checking. Your brain didn't evolve for this. It evolved to focus on one thing at a time: the conversation, a task, a threat, not hundreds of tiny inputs per minute. So even though it feels like you're in control, your brain is constantly reacting, switching, resetting, and using up willpower to stay afloat. Now here's the deeper problem. When your attention is always pulled outward, you lose access to your inner world. You stop reflecting, you stop wondering, you stop listening to yourself, because thinking deeply takes time. And if every quiet moment is filled with noise, you never get that time. So how do you fix it? First, realize your attention is valuable. It's not free. Every time you give it away, you're paying with your time, your energy, your clarity. Start treating it like something to protect. That means turning off unnecessary notifications, taking breaks from content that doesn't serve you, creating space where nothing is demanding your attention, doing one thing at a time, and letting that be enough. And most importantly, getting bored again. Boredom used to be normal. Now it's rare because the second it appears, you open a screen. But boredom isn't bad. It's the space where imagination happens, where your mind can wander, process, and connect dots. If you want your focus back, you have to be willing to sit in the silence that focus requires. Attention is your most precious resource. Spend it like it matters, because it does. The prisoner's dilemma. Let's say you and your closest friend get arrested for something serious. You're both guilty, not innocent, not framed. You actually did it, together. But now you're separated. No contact, no plan, no warning. Just a detective who slides a paper across the table and says, if you testify against your friend, you go free. They'll get 10 years. But if you stay silent and they testify against you, you're the one who gets 10. If you both stay silent, you each get 2. If you both talk, you both get 5. You stare at the wall and do the math. You want to stay loyal. You want to believe they will too. But what if they're flipping right now? What if they think you're flipping? There's no time, no second chances. And in the end, you betray them, just to avoid being betrayed first. That's the prisoner's dilemma. A situation where two people could walk away with the smallest punishment, but both end up with something much worse, because neither one was willing to risk trusting the other. And here's the part no one likes to admit. Most people, when it gets bad enough, don't stay loyal. They protect themselves. And that's what makes this paradox so dark, not because it's hard to understand, but because it's easy to imagine. This isn't just a hypothetical. The same logic plays out in everyday life, all the time. You're in a relationship. You could open up, be vulnerable, but what if they don't? So you stay guarded, and they stay guarded, and both of you slowly drift apart, convinced the other one didn't care. You're on a team at work. You could go all in, contribute everything. But what if others take advantage of your effort? So you hold back, just a little, and so does everyone else. Now the whole project underdelivers, and no one really knows why. You're part of a society. You could pay your taxes, follow the rules, do your part. But what if others are cheating the system? So you cheat just a little, and then so do they. And soon, trust collapses, and no one's really cooperating anymore. That's the danger of this paradox. It punishes trust, it rewards fear, and it traps people in cycles of self-protection that make everyone worse off, even when they know better. Game theory shows that in one-time scenarios, betrayal is common, because you only get one shot, and trusting someone else feels too risky. But in repeated games, trust can grow. If you know you'll face the same person again and again, tomorrow, next week, next year, it becomes smarter to cooperate. Because if you betray them now, they'll remember. That's why long-term relationships, reputation, and consistency matter so much in human systems. They make trust a rational move again. The real problem is this: most people don't betray because they're evil. They betray because they're scared. They don't trust the other person will do the right thing, so they strike first to avoid being left behind. And sometimes they're right, but sometimes both people were planning to stay loyal until fear changed the outcome. Newcomb's paradox. Let's say there's a sealed box sitting in front of you. It might contain $1 million, or it might contain nothing. Next to it is a clear box. You can see it has $1,000 inside. Here's the offer. You can take both boxes, or only the sealed one. Whatever you choose, you keep. But there's a twist. The sealed box was placed there by a powerful artificial intelligence, one that has studied people like you in situations like this thousands of times. It predicts what you'll do before you do it. If it predicted that you'd take only the sealed box, it filled it with the $1 million. If it predicted you'd take both boxes, it left the sealed one empty, and now you have to choose. Take both and guarantee yourself at least $1,000, or take only the sealed box and hope the AI predicted you would. This is Newcomb's paradox, and it forces you into a decision where logic fights with belief and free will collides with prediction. Let's break down the tension. If the prediction has already been made, the money is already in the box, or it's not. So logically, taking both boxes gives you more money no matter what. Either you get $1,000 plus $1 million, or $1,000 plus nothing. Why leave money on the table? But here's the problem. This AI has been right, almost always. Every person who tried to outsmart it and took both boxes walked away with just the $1,000. The ones who believed walked away with $1 million. So now you're not just choosing between boxes, you're choosing between two world views. Do you believe in logic, probability, and control? Or do you trust that your decision was already predicted, and that the outcome depends on whether or not you can act like someone worth betting on? It's easy to write this off as a theoretical experiment, but it's not. We make decisions like this all the time, just without the boxes. Think about job interviews. You prepare differently if you think the company already wants you. You walk in with more confidence, and that confidence makes the prediction come true. Or dating. If you believe someone's interested in you, you act more relaxed, more real, and that belief shapes the result. If you believe they're not, you pull back, become defensive, and prove yourself right. It's the same logic. The prediction changes the behavior, and the behavior changes the outcome. That's what makes Newcomb's paradox so disturbing. It's not about a machine guessing your choice. It's about how much of your behavior is already predictable, and how often you sabotage good outcomes by trying to win a game that depends on trust. The darker truth is this. Most of us say we believe in free will, but we act like we're being watched. We try to outgame systems, outsmart people, outsmart fate. And in doing so, we often lose what was already waiting for us, because we couldn't just believe it would be there. That's the paradox. By trying to guarantee success, we often talk ourselves out of it. Sometimes, the smartest move isn't the most calculated one. It's the one that shows you trusted yourself enough to commit. Regret paradox. Let's talk about regret. You spend weeks deciding between two job offers. You weigh the pros and cons, talk to everyone, sleep on it, then finally choose. A week later, something small goes wrong, and suddenly all you can think about is the road you didn't take. Now you're not just dealing with a problem, you're dealing with regret. And the longer you think about it, the more certain you feel that you made the wrong choice, even if that's not actually true. This is the regret paradox. The idea that you can only feel regret once you've already committed, and by the time you feel it, you can't go back. Before you choose, there's uncertainty. You don't know what will happen, so you focus on making the best possible decision. You're anxious, sure, but it's a productive kind of anxiety. You're trying to get it right, but the moment you choose, something shifts. You now have something to compare your reality against, the version of life where you made the other choice. And that version is always cleaner, easier, and more perfect, because it only exists in your imagination. It doesn't include the trade-offs. It doesn't include the unknown problems. It's idealized and impossible to verify. But emotionally, it feels real, so real that people spiral into it. They start to question the decision itself, not based on facts, but based on how they feel after the fact. And that's the trap. We tend to think that regret is a sign we chose poorly, but most of the time, it's just a sign that we chose at all. You can only regret something once a door has closed. Once the options are gone, once you've committed to one future and walked away from another. And what makes this paradox worse is that the intensity of regret isn't always tied to the size of the decision. People feel deep regret over minor things, sending a message too early, missing a flight by 5 minutes, buying the wrong gift, simply because the alternative outcome was visible, easy to imagine, and just out of reach. In fact, the closer the missed opportunity feels, the worse the regret. Psychologists call this counterfactual thinking, the mental habit of imagining how things could have gone differently. And your brain is exceptionally good at building those alternate realities. But those imagined paths don't come with their own problems. They're not complete lives. They're highlight reels of something that never happened and never will. The paradox is this: you do your best to make a good decision, but the very act of deciding creates the conditions for regret. And if you let that feeling take over, it doesn't just poison your memory, it damages your ability to choose again. People who regret too much start avoiding decisions. They delay, overthink, ask for more time, more input, more guarantees. But none of that stops regret, because regret doesn't come from making bad choices. It comes from being human and wondering if you could have done better. So how do you deal with it? Not by eliminating regret, but by recognizing what it is. It's a reaction, not a warning. It's not a message from the past. It's a story your brain writes after the fact. And often, it's fiction. You can't undo every mistake. You can't explore every path, but you can stop replaying decisions you made. With the best information you had at the time, you made a choice. You moved forward. And yes, it could have gone differently, but so could the alternative. That's what regret doesn't show you. And that's why it's a paradox. It only works by hiding everything you'll never get to see. Buridan's arse. Buridan's arse is one of the oldest paradoxes in decision-making, but it describes a problem most people face today more than ever. Here's how it goes. Imagine a donkey who is placed exactly midway between two identical piles of hay. Both are the same size, the same distance away, and equally appealing. The donkey, being perfectly rational, tries to decide which pile to eat, but because they are identical in every respect, it has no reason to choose one over the other, so it waits, and eventually dies of hunger, not because it lacked food, but because it lacked a reason to choose. It sounds absurd, but we do this to ourselves all the time. You're offered two equally attractive job offers. You're considering two cities to live in. You're weighing two career paths. Neither is obviously better. So what do? You hesitate. You overthink. You compare and analyze, trying to find the right answer until the opportunity disappears. Or time forces a decision. Or worse, you do nothing at all. This is Buridan's ass in real life. The inability to act when faced with equivalent options. The paradox lies in the logic. If a rational decision maker has no reason to prefer one option over the other, they have no basis for choosing. But inaction isn't neutral. In the real world, waiting has consequences. Delay carries cost. Time moves forward, even when you don't. We're taught that rational decision-making is about comparing all the facts and picking the best possible option. But sometimes, the facts are too similar. And in those moments, rationality can turn against itself. It starts to demand certainty that doesn't exist. It insists on a reason that isn't there. This is especially common in a world that encourages optimization. You're told to find the perfect career, the ideal partner, the best investment. So when two choices look equally good, you feel stuck because anything less than best feels like failure. But here's the truth. In situations like this, there may be no right answer, and trying to force one can lead to paralysis. Buridan's arse teaches a harsh but important lesson. Sometimes, trying to make the perfect choice is what keeps you from making any choice at all. And that's dangerous. Because inaction has consequences. In real life, opportunities disappear. Markets move. People move on. Your energy changes. The longer you stay stuck, the more pressure builds, and the harder it becomes to act at all. So what's the answer? Sometimes, it's to let go of the illusion that you can optimize everything. If two options are genuinely equal, then the choice doesn't matter as much as the act of choosing. Momentum beats analysis. Movement creates clarity. You don't always need to pick the perfect path. You need to walk one of them long enough to find out where it goes. This paradox isn't just about indecisiveness. It's about the hidden cost of trying to be perfectly rational in a world full of imperfect data, conflicting values, and time pressure. The donkey dies waiting for a reason. Humans don't have to. Condorcet Paradox. 3 candidates. 3 voters. Each voter ranks the candidates from most to least preferred. Voter 1 prefers A over B and B over C. Voter 2 prefers B over C and C over A. Voter 3 prefers C over A and A over B. Now look what happens. Between A and B, 2 voters prefer A, so A wins. Between B and C, 2 voters prefer B, B wins. Between C and A, 2 voters prefer B, B wins. But between C and A, 2 voters prefer shouldn't be possible. If A beats B and B beats C, then A should beat C. But it doesn't. This is the Condorcet Paradox, also known as the voting paradox, and it shows something unsettling. Even if everyone votes rationally, the group can end up making an irrational decision. Most people assume that democratic systems, majority rule, fair voting, lead to fair outcomes. But this paradox reveals a flaw that can't be fixed with better candidates or smarter voters. It's a structural problem. The system doesn't always produce a clear winner. In fact, it can cycle endlessly, where no option is consistently preferred over all others. That's not just frustrating, it's dangerous. Because in the real world, this happens in elections, policy decisions, hiring committees, and boardrooms, anywhere people vote on ranked options. And when the outcome feels inconsistent or contradictory, people start to question the system itself. They don't say, "This is a paradox." They say, "This is rigged." The deeper problem is this: we want group decision-making to reflect collective wisdom, but that only works when preferences align neatly. When people have diverse but reasonable preferences, the system can produce results no one actually wanted, not because of corruption, not because of bad faith, but because the math breaks down. This paradox doesn't mean democracy is doomed, but it does mean that majority rule alone isn't perfect. In situations with more than 2 options, the outcome can depend more on how you count the votes than on what people actually believe. That's why different voting systems, ranked choice, instant runoff, approval voting, all exist. Each one tries to solve the problem in a slightly different way, but none of them are immune to paradox. They just shift where the weirdness happens. The truth is, there's no such thing as a perfectly fair voting system. That's not opinion, it's math. In fact, this was proven in what's called Arrow's impossibility theorem, which says no voting method can turn individual preferences into a group decision without violating some basic fairness criteria. In other words, you can't always get a fair answer out of fair people. And that's the real paradox. We believe in the wisdom of crowds, but sometimes crowds don't think clearly. Sometimes systems that are supposed to give us certainty deliver chaos instead. And the scariest part, it's not a glitch, it's built in. The paradox of choice. Modern life gives us more choices than any generation before us. You can stream thousands of shows, apply for hundreds of jobs, order any meal, talk to anyone, or travel almost anywhere. The options are endless. That's supposed to be progress. That's supposed to make us happier, but it doesn't. In practice, more choices often make people more anxious, less satisfied, and more likely to avoid making a decision at all. This is what psychologists call the paradox of choice. The idea that too much freedom, too many options, can become a burden instead of a benefit. This isn't just a philosophical idea, it's backed by evidence. One of the most cited studies on this subject came from Columbia University. Researchers set up a jam sampling station in a grocery store. Sometimes they offered customers 24 different flavors, sometimes only 6. The larger display attracted more attention, but shoppers were 10 times more likely to actually buy when there were fewer choices. The variety pulled people in, but it paralyzed them when it came time to decide. This applies far beyond jam. College graduates often feel overwhelmed when faced with multiple job offers. Entrepreneurs struggle to pick one product to build. People scroll endlessly through Netflix, unable to pick a show. Singles on dating apps swipe for hours and still feel unsure. Why? Because every choice comes with a cost. The opportunity cost of not choosing the other options. And that cost isn't just practical, it's emotional. With every additional option, 3 things happen. You increase your expectations. With so many choices, the odds should be higher that you find something perfect. You increase the pressure. If you end up unhappy, it must be your fault. You had so many chances to get it right. You increase regret. Even if you make a good decision, the knowledge that you could have chosen differently lingers. This leads to what psychologists call choice overload or decision fatigue. The more choices you have, the more your brain has to weigh, compare, and second guess. The mental strain builds, and eventually you either avoid deciding altogether or feel worse about what you did choose. But here's the twist. It's not that choice itself is bad. In fact, a lack of choice can be just as damaging. It leads to feelings of helplessness, frustration, and resentment. What makes this a paradox is that both too little and too much choice can hurt you, but in different ways. At low levels, adding options increases your satisfaction, but past a certain point, more options reduce clarity, drain mental energy, and increase dissatisfaction. That point is different for everyone, but the curve is real, and the effects show up across society. In workplaces, employees feel paralyzed by too many tools and project directions. In healthcare, patients feel overwhelmed by complex treatment options they don't understand. In personal life, people struggle to commit to relationships, hobbies, even where to live. Because the moment you commit to one path, you're closing the door to all the others. This isn't just a modern annoyance. It's a structural feature of modern life. We built a world where optionality is everywhere, but the skill of deciding, of filtering, prioritizing, and letting go hasn't evolved as quickly. We don't just need the freedom to choose, we need the psychological strength to choose less. The paradox is this: the more freedom we have, the more discipline we need. Without that discipline, freedom becomes overwhelming. Without that clarity, abundance becomes a trap. Procrastination paradox. You tell yourself you'll do it later. Not never, just not now. You'll study tomorrow. Start the project next week. Clean up after one more scroll. Fix the problem when things calm down. And you believe it. You really do. You're not avoiding it forever. You're just pushing it into some better version of time that hasn't arrived yet. That's the trap. This is the procrastination paradox. The idea that you delay action by telling yourself you'll definitely act later. And somehow, later never shows up. You're not lazy. You care. You're aware. You even feel guilty about it. But the task stays undone. Not because you've rejected it, but because you've temporarily negotiated with it. And that's what makes procrastination so dangerous. It's not direct avoidance. It's not a refusal. It's a delay disguised as intention. Psychologists call this present bias. Your brain prioritizes comfort now over discomfort later. And because the consequences aren't immediate, you give yourself permission to push it back. And every time you do that, you reward yourself. You escape the task, and you feel better, at least for a moment. That's positive reinforcement. And your brain learns fast. Research shows that procrastination isn't always about poor time management. In fact, many chronic procrastinators are highly organized in other parts of life. It's about emotional regulation, avoiding the feelings a task brings up: uncertainty, boredom, self-doubt, fear of not doing it perfectly. So instead of doing the thing, you do something easier, something you can finish, something that won't judge you, and you tell yourself you're still being productive, and just not in that direction. But the paradox is this: You delay because you want to avoid stress, but that delay creates more stress, and the longer you avoid it, the worse the task feels, so you delay more. It's a feedback loop, and it feeds itself until the only thing stronger than your fear of doing the task is your fear of running out of time. So eventually, you act, but not with clarity, not with control, with panic, and sometimes that panic creates just enough adrenaline to get you through, and when it works, it becomes a system. You don't just procrastinate accidentally, you start to rely on it. That's when it becomes a cycle, one that feels familiar, but always ends the same way, with stress, regret, and exhaustion. And the real cost, it's not just time, it's the mental weight of carrying 15 unfinished tasks in your head. It's the guilt that follows you around, even when you're resting. It's the story you start to tell yourself that you can't be trusted with hard things. That's how procrastination turns into shame, and shame makes it even harder to start next time. So, what's the way out? Not by waiting for motivation, not by promising you'll be better next week, but by recognizing the lie, the idea that there's ever a better time, that your future self will magically be more disciplined, more confident, more prepared, is how the paradox sustains itself. You don't need to finish everything right now, but you do need to begin, not because it's easy, but because the cost of not starting is slowly becoming your default. And in the end, the choice isn't between doing it now or doing it later. It's between doing it now or never doing it at all. A paradox of risk aversion. Most people don't think of themselves as risk takers. They're careful, responsible, they avoid danger. Play it safe. They think long term. But here's what they don't realize. Sometimes, avoiding risk is the biggest risk of all. This is the paradox of risk aversion. The idea that in trying to avoid uncertainty, discomfort, or failure, you create even bigger, longer-term problems that you can't see until it's too late. Here's a simple example. You don't speak up in a meeting because you're afraid your idea might sound stupid. So you stay quiet. You avoid that short-term risk. But what's the long-term cost? Your ideas don't get heard. You don't stand out. You're overlooked, passed over. You don't grow, and eventually you're not even in the room anymore. You avoided a tiny risk today and paid for it slowly, over years, or this. You keep your money in a savings account. It feels safe. No stock market crashes. No sudden losses. But over time, inflation quietly eats your money. Your safe choice loses value every year. You avoided volatility, but guaranteed loss. Or this, you stay in a relationship that isn't working because breaking up is painful, uncertain, lonely. So you avoid the risk of heartbreak and trade it for years of quiet resentment, emotional stagnation, and slowly disappearing self-worth. That's the cost, and that's the paradox. You avoid discomfort today, but end up with far more of it later. Psychologically, this comes down to a simple bias. Humans are more sensitive to losses than to gains. We'll do more to avoid losing something than we will to gain something of equal value. It's called loss aversion, and it drives a lot of the worst decisions people make. We stay in the wrong job, the wrong city, the wrong mindset, not because we believe it's the best option, but because it's the option we're least afraid of. And fear is powerful. It convinces us that staying still is safer than moving forward. But in many cases, it isn't. Long-term regret almost never comes from taking a risk that didn't work out. It comes from never taking the risk at all. The job you never applied for, the business you never started, the conversation you avoided, the life you imagined but never stepped into. Those aren't failures, they're what fear left behind. Avoiding risk isn't always wrong, but it's never free. And if your goal is to never feel uncomfortable, you'll end up feeling something worse, trapped. So, next time you find yourself backing away from something because it feels scary, ask a better question. What's the cost of not doing this? Not today, but 5 years from now. Simpson's Paradox. 2 doctors are being compared. One doctor has a higher success rate with both men and women. But when you combine the numbers, something strange happens. The doctor who lost both categories suddenly has the better overall score. That's not a mistake. That's Simpson's paradox, where a trend that appears in individual groups reverses when the groups are combined. In simple terms, the data tells one story when you look closely and the opposite story when you zoom out. It sounds like a math glitch, but this shows up everywhere, in medicine, hiring, education, even criminal justice. And if you don't know it's happening, it's easy to draw the wrong conclusion and make the wrong decision. Here's a classic example. A university is accused of gender bias in admissions. Overall, more men are accepted than women. That looks like clear discrimination. But when researchers break the data down by department, a different story emerges. In nearly every department, women were accepted at a higher rate than men. So, what happened? Women tended to apply to more competitive departments, where the acceptance rate was lower for everyone. Men applied more often to departments that accepted more students. The university wasn't biased against women, but the data made it look like it was P2, until someone asked the right question. That's the danger of Simpson's paradox. It hides inside the numbers and punishes anyone who trusts surface-level statistics. Now imagine this in public health. A drug trial shows that drug A works better for younger people, and drug B works better for older people. But when the data is aggregated, it looks like drug B works better for everyone. If no one checks, drug A might get pulled from the market, even though it's the better option for half the population. That's not just a math problem. That's a mistake with real lives attached to it. The paradox is this: the truth can disappear when you look at too much data all at once. And the more we rely on big data, the easier it is to miss what's hiding underneath. Even well-intentioned decisions by judges, hiring managers, doctors, or algorithms can be wildly wrong if they're built on distorted trends. So what do? You slow down. You ask better questions. You break things apart before drawing conclusions. The most dangerous mistake you can make is thinking the numbers can't lie. They can, not because they're wrong, but because they're incomplete. The paradox of help. You see someone struggling. You step in to help. You offer advice, solutions, a shortcut to fix the problem. At first it feels like kindness, but over time, something shifts. They stop trying. They stop thinking for themselves. They stop believing they're capable. And now, they're not just struggling, they're dependent. That's the paradox of help. The idea that the more you help someone, the more you might be hurting their ability to help themselves. This shows up everywhere. A parent does their child's homework to save them time, to avoid frustration. But the child doesn't learn. They just learn to rely. A manager steps in every time an employee struggles. Deadlines are met, mistakes are avoided, but the employee never grows. They never gain confidence because they never had to earn it. Or in relationships, you solve all your partner's problems. You carry their weight. You make things easy, but slowly they stop trying to solve anything at all. At its core, this paradox is about intention versus effect. You intend to support. You want to make life easier for someone you care about. But the effect is this: they don't feel supported. They feel incapable. And that feeling of being helpless, of being rescued constantly, can quietly become humiliation. Psychologist Martin Seligman studied this dynamic in a series of experiments on learned helplessness. In one version, animals were placed in a situation where they were repeatedly exposed to mild discomfort, but given no way to stop it. Eventually, when the option to escape was introduced, they didn't even try. They had learned, wrongly, that they had no control. The same thing happens to people. If every challenge is handled for you, you stop believing you can handle things yourself. Even small obstacles feel impossible, not because they are, but because you've internalized the idea that you're not the one who solves things. That's not compassion. That's disempowerment. There's another layer. Helping makes you feel good. It gives you control. It confirms your usefulness. It builds a story where you're the strong one, the one who knows what's best, and that can be addictive. You may think you're being generous, but sometimes help is also ego in disguise. You want to be needed. You want to be right. You want to be the one they rely on, and so you help. again and again and again, even when it starts to harm them. That's the dark side of help. It creates dependency. It keeps people small. It reinforces inequality, not because you intended to, but because you never gave them the space to stand up on their own. So what's the alternative? Not doing nothing, not withholding support, but changing how you help. It means asking instead of assuming, offering tools, not just answers, letting people struggle, not to watch them fail, but to give them the chance to succeed. Real help doesn't say, "Let me fix this for you." It says, "I know you can fix this, and I'll support you while you try." Because the goal of helping someone should never be to keep them needing you. It should be to help them no longer need help at all. That's not detachment, that's respect. The Abilene Paradox. You're sitting with a group. Someone suggests an idea, dinner plans, a weekend trip, a new direction at work. You don't love it. You're not even sure it's a good idea, but everyone else seems okay with it, so you nod along. What you don't know is they're doing the exact same thing. No one really wants this, but no one wants to be the one who says it. So the group agrees, and everyone ends up doing something nobody actually wanted. That's the Abilene Paradox, where people collectively agree to a decision that no one individually supports, because they each falsely assume the others want it. The paradox is named after a story. A family in Texas is sitting on a porch during a hot summer day. Someone says, "We could drive to Abilene for dinner. It's 50 miles away. The food isn't great. The car has no air conditioning." But nobody objects. They don't want to seem negative. They assume everyone else wants to go. So they all pile into the car, suffer through a miserable, sweaty drive, eat a disappointing meal, and come home exhausted. When they finally talk about it, they realize not a single person actually wanted to go. They just went along to avoid rocking the boat. This happens more often than most people realize. In meetings, in families, in friend groups, in relationships. One person suggests something vague or neutral, and instead of questioning it, everyone signals approval. Why? Because it's easier to agree than to be the one who disagrees. And so decisions get made, not based on desire or logic, but on mutual misperception. Everyone's trying to be agreeable. And in doing so, everyone betrays what they actually want. Psychologist Jerry B. Harvey, who coined the term, called it an inability to manage agreement, not disagreement, agreement. Because the issue isn't conflict. The issue is pretending there is none. People are afraid to be the outlier, afraid of being seen as difficult, afraid of breaking group harmony. So they go along even when going along leads to worse outcomes for everyone. This happens in relationships too. One person suggests a change, move to a new city, have kids, try something new. The other person hesitates, but sees how confident their partner seems. So they say yes, even though they're not sure. The other person, unaware of the doubt, feels reassured. Now both are committed to a future that neither of them fully chose. Not out of malice, just out of fear, of disappointing someone, of being the one who says no, of standing alone. This paradox shows how much damage can come from silence, and how quickly a group can walk into failure. And that's not because anyone wanted it, but because no one was willing to stop it. So how do you fix it? You create space for honesty before agreement. You ask real questions. Is anyone unsure? Are we all actually good with this? What are we not saying right now? And more importantly, you model dissent as safety, not conflict. Because when people are too afraid to disagree, they stop communicating. And once that happens, you're not making decisions together, you're just performing consensus. And that's what the Abilene Paradox really is. A performance where everyone's pretending they're on board, just to avoid being the one who says what everyone else is thinking. The trust paradox. You want to trust someone. You want to believe they're honest, reliable, loyal. But instead of simply trusting them, you start testing them. You ask little questions to catch inconsistency. You hide things to see if they'll notice. You hold back emotionally, just in case. And what starts as caution becomes a slow erosion of the very thing you were trying to build. That's the trust paradox. We say we want trust, but but often act in ways that destroy it before it ever gets a chance to grow. Here's the core problem. Trust requires vulnerability, but vulnerability feels unsafe. So we protect ourselves. But in protecting ourselves, we create distance. We become suspicious. We withhold. And that withholding tells the other person not to trust us either. And now you're both doing the same thing, waiting for the other person to go first. Neither one wanting to get hurt, neither one willing to take the risk, and in that mutual hesitation, trust dies before it even starts. This is common in romantic relationships. One person has been hurt before, cheated on, lied to, abandoned. They say they want honesty, openness, but they double-check messages. They overanalyze tone. They assume the worst and make their partner feel watched, distrusted. Eventually, the partner pulls away, not because they were untrustworthy, but because being constantly doubted became unbearable. And now the cycle is complete. The fear of betrayal creates the conditions for betrayal. This also happens in parenting. A child breaks a rule. A parent reacts by tightening control. More surveillance, more rules, less freedom. The child now feels distrusted. So they start hiding things, not because they're bad, but because they don't feel safe. Being honest, and again, the result is the very thing the parent feared, a breakdown in trust. Psychologically, this is rooted in something called defensive pessimism. People who've been hurt before will assume the worst to avoid being surprised again. It gives a sense of control, but the cost is high. It blocks connection. It makes intimacy feel like a trap. And worst of all, it punishes the people who actually are trustworthy. So what's the answer? A blind trust? No. Trust isn't about ignoring red flags. It's about understanding this trust can't be tested into existence. It has to be given, in small doses at first, but with sincerity. And it grows not when you get proof, but when you create space for truth. That means giving people room to be honest, to make small mistakes, to recover from doubt without being permanently labeled. It means saying, I'm scared, but I'm choosing to believe in you anyway. That's real trust. Not certainty, but courage. The Social Loafing Paradox. You're in a group project, 5 people, shared responsibility. At first, you're motivated. You want to contribute, but as the group gets bigger, something shifts. You start doing less. You assume others will pick up the slack, and you're not alone. They're thinking the same thing. So instead of working harder together, everyone ends up doing less. That's the social loafing paradox, the strange, proven phenomenon, where the more people are involved, the less effort each individual tends to put in. This isn't a theory, it's been measured. In a famous study from the 1970s, researchers asked participants to pull on a rope. When they pulled alone, they gave it full strength, but when they were told others were pulling with them, their effort dropped by up to 50%, even if the others weren't really pulling. Why? Because responsibility became shared, and shared responsibility dilutes individual accountability. You think, I don't have to give 100%, someone else will. So you coast, and when everyone thinks that way, the whole system slows down. This shows up in the workplace all the time. A large team is assigned to a new project. No one's sure who's doing what. Deadlines blur. Accountability gets soft. And soon, the team is doing less than any one of them would have done alone. It also happens on social media. In slacktivism, a tragedy goes viral. Millions of people express outrage. But because so many people are reacting, very few people feel individually responsible to act. Everyone feels like something is happening, but almost nothing happens. Social loafing also hides in relationships. When one partner takes initiative, the other sometimes withdraws, not out of laziness, but because they assume the other person has it covered. I don't have to plan the vacation, they'll do it. I don't need to initiate a deep conversation, they always bring things up. And slowly, one person starts feeling the weight of the relationship alone. So why does this happen? It comes down to 2 psychological forces: diffusion of responsibility, where effort is diluted across the group; reduced visibility, when people think their individual contribution isn't being seen. If no one notices whether you tried or not, you try less. This is especially true in environments without feedback, recognition, or structure. People don't slack off because they're lazy. They slack off because the system makes it easy to disappear. The paradox is this: when everyone is responsible, no one feels responsible. And the more people you add, the more likely each person is to assume someone else will carry the load. This is why small teams often outperform large ones, because in small groups, your absence is obvious, your effort is seen, and that visibility creates motivation. So how do you fix it? Not by shrinking every group, but by making individual contributions visible and meaningful. You create clear roles, you give feedback, you reward ownership, and most importantly, you make sure that everyone knows your effort matters and it's noticed, because people don't need constant praise. They just need to know they're not invisible. The liar paradox. The sentence is, this sentence is false. If that sentence is true, then it must be false, because that's what it says. But if it's false, that means the sentence is not false, which makes it true. That's the paradox. It cannot be true without being false. It cannot be false without being true. It creates a contradiction that cannot be resolved. This is called the liar paradox. It was first recorded by the ancient Greek philosopher Epimenides, who said, "All Cretans are liars." He was a Cretan himself. If what he said is true, then he must be lying. But if he's lying, then not all Cretans are liars, which means the statement might be false, but also true. Same problem. Later versions made it simpler. I am lying. Everything I say is false. This sentence is false. All of them are self-referential, meaning the sentence refers to itself. This causes a logical loop that doesn't end in a clear result. This isn't just a curiosity. It matters in logic, philosophy, computer science, and even in real conversations. In formal logic, the liar paradox shows that some statements cannot be assigned a truth value. They are undecedable, not because we lack information, but because their structure breaks the rules of logic. This led to developments in mathematical logic, including Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Kurt Gödel used a similar technique to show that in any logical system, complex enough to include arithmetic, there will be statements that are true, but cannot be proven within the system. So the liar paradox helped reveal limits of formal logic and self-reference. In computer science, this type of paradox is related to infinite loops, system crashes, and unsolvable problems. Alan Turing proved that it is impossible to create a program that can determine for every possible program whether it will stop or run forever. This is called the halting problem. Turing's proof also uses self-reference, a machine analyzing itself, and runs into paradox when it tries to predict its own behavior. Outside of logic and computing, the liar paradox also appears in human communication, especially in manipulative or confusing language. Example: someone says, "I'm lying to you right now." You can't tell if they are being honest or dishonest, because the statement breaks itself. It gives you no stable ground to trust or reject. In relationships, a softer version appears when someone says one thing, but behaves in a way that contradicts it, and acknowledges the contradiction without resolving it. Example: I don't trust anyone, not even myself. If they're telling the truth, then they don't trust their own statement, which collapses the meaning. Or, I always lie. If that's true, it must be a lie. If it's a lie, then maybe they tell the truth, but then the statement is false again. This kind of loop leads to communication breakdown, where words stop carrying reliable meaning. In psychology, chronic liars or people with certain personality disorders sometimes create this kind of confusion. They say things that contradict themselves and then challenge you to prove they lied, even when no consistent version of the truth exists. This technique creates cognitive overload and emotional fatigue, which are common tactics in gaslighting. This paradox cannot be fixed. It doesn't have a resolution. Its purpose is to reveal limitations in logic, in language, and in how we try to define truth. The real takeaway is this: not every sentence can be judged as true or false. Some are structurally broken, and sometimes the confusion isn't a matter of opinion. It's built into the statement itself. The Hedonic Paradox. You want to be happy. That seems reasonable, so you chase it. You do the things that are supposed to make you feel good. You set goals, you buy things, you take vacations, and at first, it works. But then something strange happens. The harder you try to be happy, the harder it gets to stay that way. And eventually, the effort to feel good becomes the thing that makes you feel worse. This is the Hedonic Paradox, the idea that directly pursuing happiness often makes it harder to achieve. Psychologists have studied this effect for decades. One key reason is called hedonic adaptation. It means we get used to things fast. You win the lottery, you feel incredible. But after a few months, you return to your old baseline. Your new normal feels normal. The same thing happens when you buy something exciting. A new phone, a new car, a bigger apartment. At first, it boosts your mood. Then it fades, and you start wanting something else. The brain is wired to adapt. It protects us from long-term suffering, but it also limits long-term satisfaction. And that's why chasing happiness directly often leads to disappointment. Because no matter what you get, the feeling wears off. And now you're stuck looking for the next hit. Another reason this paradox happens is expectation. The more you expect something to make you happy, the more pressure you put on the outcome. You go on a trip thinking it'll change everything. It doesn't. Now you're not just disappointed in the trip, you're disappointed in yourself for not enjoying it more. This creates guilt. You tell yourself, I should be happy. And now, even your happiness feels like a failure. Studies show that people who rate happiness as a top priority tend to report lower life satisfaction. Not because happiness isn't good, but because turning it into a constant goal sets them up for frustration. So what actually works? The research is clear. Happiness is often a side effect, not a target. It shows up when you're focused on something else. When you're absorbed in meaningful work, when you're spending time with people you trust, when you're challenged, curious, or helping someone else. You're not thinking, am I happy right now? You're just present, and that's when it shows up. The paradox isn't that happiness is impossible, it's that chasing it directly gets in the way. And sometimes, the best way to feel better is to stop obsessing over whether you do. The paradox of vulnerability. You've probably had a moment like this. You decide to be honest. You open up about something real, something that's been on your mind. You tell someone you're scared, or that you're struggling, or that you care more than you let on. You expect it to bring you closer, and maybe sometimes it does. But other times, it doesn't. They go quiet. They change the subject. Or worse, they pull away. And suddenly, you regret saying anything at all. That's the paradox of vulnerability. You open up to connect, but opening up is also the fastest way to feel exposed, rejected, or misunderstood. We're told that vulnerability is the foundation of trust, and that's not wrong. But what's often left out is this. Vulnerability doesn't guarantee closeness. It only gives you a chance at it, and that chance always comes with risk. Most people learn this early. You share something real, it doesn't land well, so you pull back. And next time, you say less. It starts small. You don't bring up what's bothering you. You don't tell your friend you feel left out. You avoid the hard conversation with your partner. You pretend you're okay, even when you're not. It feels safer. You avoid discomfort in the short term. But slowly, without noticing, you build a wall, and what started as self-protection becomes disconnection. This happens in relationships, at work, even with family. You want to be seen, but not judged. You want to be known, but not rejected. And so you stay just a little out of reach, close enough to seem open, but far enough to avoid risk. The result? People like you. They respect you, but they don't really know you. And without realizing it, you start to feel alone, even when you're not. That's the cost of avoiding vulnerability. You trade authenticity for control, and over time the relationships around you start to feel hollow. The paradox goes deeper. The more you hide, the more people misunderstand you. The more they misunderstand you, the more isolated you feel. And the more isolated you feel, the harder it gets to open up. It's a cycle, and it feeds on itself. So what are you supposed to do? Just spill everything to everyone? Of course not. Vulnerability doesn't mean oversharing. It means being honest when it matters. It means showing up as yourself, even if that self is uncertain, imperfect, or afraid. It means saying, I don't know, instead of pretending you do. It means saying, that hurt, when something actually does. It means saying, this is hard for me, instead of pushing through silently. And no, not everyone deserves that version of you. Some people haven't earned your vulnerability. Some people will misuse it. That's part of the risk. But the answer isn't to hide from everyone. It's to be selective, not silent. You build trust in layers. You open up gradually. You pay attention to who listens, who respects it, and who disappears. Because real connection doesn't come from people always accepting you. It comes from being willing to show up anyway, and finding the few people who can meet you there. That's what makes vulnerability powerful. Not that it's always safe, but that it's the only path to something real. The backfire effect. You're in an argument, you're calm, you're informed, you know the facts. So you explain them clearly, patiently. You expect the other person to understand, maybe even change their mind, but they don't. In fact, they dig in deeper, they double down, they reject your facts, and become even more convinced they were right all along. That's not just frustrating, it's psychological. It's called the backfire effect, a phenomenon where presenting someone with evidence that contradicts their beliefs doesn't make them question those beliefs, it strengthens them. This effect was first described in a 2010 study by political scientists Brendan Newcomb and Jason Reifler. They found that when people were presented with corrections to misinformation, especially about emotionally charged topics like politics or health, many didn't revise their thinking. Some actually became more entrenched in their original views. Their beliefs didn't weaken, they hardened. It seems irrational, but the brain isn't built for truth. It's built for coherence, for internal consistency. We want the world to make sense with what we already believe. When someone presents evidence that threatens that structure, it creates cognitive dissonance, a kind of psychological discomfort. To relieve that discomfort, the brain finds a shortcut: reject the information, attack the source, reinterpret the data to fit the existing belief. And just like that, facts bounce off, or worse, backfire. This effect is especially strong when identity is involved. If someone believes something that's tied to their worldview, their culture, their religion, their community, then challenging that belief feels like a personal attack. It's not just about the claim, it's about who they are. And when identity is under threat, facts don't matter, defense does. This happens constantly in debates about vaccines, politics, religion, conspiracy theories, even parenting styles. A person might say, show me the proof. But when you do, it doesn't change anything. Because the issue isn't the data, it's the fear of being wrong. Being wrong is uncomfortable. It means admitting weakness. It might mean rethinking your values, your past decisions, or the people you trust. And for many people, that cost is too high. So instead, the belief becomes even stronger, and the person becomes harder to reach. The backfire effect isn't universal. It doesn't happen in every situation or with every person, but it happens enough that researchers have had to rethink how public messaging works. In some studies, especially among politically aware or educated participants, exposure to corrections had no backfire effect. But among people with high emotional investment in a belief, it's still a real risk. That's why the strategy of just educating people doesn't always work. Facts aren't enough. Because people don't change their minds when they feel attacked. They change when they feel safe. This is why tone matters, intent matters, and timing matters. If someone believes you're trying to prove them wrong, they'll defend themselves. If they believe you care about them and you're not trying to win, they're more likely to listen. Psychologist Tali Sharot calls this the social component of persuasion. People don't absorb new information unless their emotional defenses are down. So the real work isn't just explaining the facts, it's lowering the threat level of the conversation. That means asking questions instead of lecturing. listening without immediately correcting, finding shared values before pointing out differences, giving people time to think instead of forcing them to choose sides. It also means being willing to check your own ego. Are you trying to change their mind or prove you're right? The paradox is simple. The more aggressively you try to correct someone, the more likely they are to reject what you say, even if you're completely right. So if the goal is truth, sometimes the best first step isn't proving the other person wrong. It's making sure they feel safe enough to reconsider on their own. That takes longer. It's less satisfying, but it works more often. The Friendship Paradox. You ever scroll through your feed and think, how do all these people have so many friends? It feels like everyone else is constantly hanging out, getting invited, doing something, and you're just sitting there, watching it happen. You don't feel antisocial. You just start wondering if you're the only one who wasn't invited. Here's what's weird. That feeling isn't just in your head. It's actually baked into how social life works. There's something called the Friendship Paradox, and it explains a lot. It says that your friends, on average, have more friends than you do. Seriously. It's not about confidence or personality. It's about math. Here's how it works. The people with the most friends naturally show up in more people's friend circles. They're the ones who get tagged more, mentioned more, invited more, not because they're better, but because they're more visible. So when you look around at your own social circle, you're more likely to see the people who seem like they're always busy, always surrounded, always in the loop. And you compare your behind the scenes to their highlight reel, and it makes you feel like you're the one missing something. But most of the time, they're not doing that much either. You're just seeing the most active people, the most visible stories, the most connected outliers, and you assume that's normal, but it's not. It's like walking into a gym and thinking everyone's in shape, because the only people you notice are the ones lifting weights. The rest are just stretching in the corner, or on their way out the door. You just didn't see them. Social life works the same way. You don't see the quiet friends who didn't go out. You don't see the people who stayed in. You don't see the ones who didn't post anything. You just see the ones who show up the most, and that skews everything. You start thinking, I should be going out more. Why don't I have that many close friends? Am I falling behind socially? But those thoughts are based on a distorted sample. The Friendship Paradox isn't about who's doing better. It's about how the loudest, busiest people are the ones you're most likely to notice, even if they feel just as disconnected as you do. In fact, some of them are. They're just better at looking like they're not. Social scientists have studied this. The more someone compares their life to others, especially on social media, the more likely they are to feel lonely, even if they're not objectively alone. You might have 5 friends and still feel like you don't belong. They might have 50 and still feel completely unseen. Because this paradox doesn't measure closeness. It doesn't measure depth. It just measures who looks like they're everywhere. And that's not the same as being fulfilled. The Expectation Paradox. You expect your birthday to be special. You expect your weekend getaway to be fun. You expect your new job to feel meaningful. You expect the person you're dating to text you back. And when those things happen, but not exactly how you pictured, they feel underwhelming. Or worse, they feel disappointing. Even if nothing technically went wrong. That's the Expectation Paradox. The more you expect something to feel good, the more likely you are to feel let down. And the opposite is often true. When you lower your expectations, your chances of feeling satisfied actually go up. This doesn't mean you should walk around assuming everything will be terrible. It just means that expectations don't just shape how you anticipate things. They shape how you experience and evaluate them afterward. Let's break it down. Psychologically, your brain builds predictions. It doesn't just wait to see what happens. It prepares a story in advance. When reality matches that story, you feel satisfied. When it doesn't, even slightly, your brain flags the experience as a kind of emotional mismatch. This is why pretty good can feel like not good enough. It's not that the event was bad, it's that it didn't line up with what you thought it would be. Take a vacation. You plan it for weeks. You imagine relaxing, perfect weather, beautiful views. You finally go, and it's nice, but the weather's a bit off. The hotel isn't as luxurious as the photos. You feel a little stressed about money. By any reasonable standard, it was a decent trip. But to you, it felt like a letdown. Now take the same trip with zero expectations. You book it last minute. You just want to get away. The same weather, same hotel, same everything. But this time, you're more relaxed because it exceeded the low bar you set in your mind. Same experience, different mental frame, very different emotional result. This has been studied in psychology. A 2014 study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that when people expect too much emotional benefit from a positive event, they often experience a kind of emotional crash afterward. They enjoy the event less than those who went in without inflated expectations. Another study from Emotion showed that people who watched a movie with high expectations rated it lower than people who had no expectations, even though both groups watched the exact same film. This isn't about pessimism. It's about how mental comparisons work. Your brain doesn't evaluate reality in a vacuum. It evaluates it relative to what you thought it would be. That's where this gets really personal. In relationships, you might expect your partner to know what's bothering you without having to say it. When they don't, you feel ignored or misunderstood. But were they actually unkind? Or did they just not meet an invisible standard you never explained? In your career, you might expect a promotion to make you feel proud, secure, or finally enough. But when it happens, and you still feel anxious or dissatisfied, you start questioning everything. The job, yourself, your future. But again, it might not be the job. It might be the inflated emotional payoff you attach to it. Even small things, like how a day should go, can ruin your mood. You think the weekend should be restful, then a few chores or interruptions pop up. Now you feel robbed. But you weren't. You just expected ease and got reality. So, what do? Not lower your standards, not give up on joy, but start noticing the stories you're writing ahead of time. Are you expecting this dinner, this trip, this job, this conversation to deliver an emotional peak? Are you setting up reality to lose? Because that's how most disappointment works. Not from what actually happens, but from what you thought was supposed to happen. This doesn't mean stop dreaming, but it does mean learning to separate hope from prediction. You can hope something goes well without needing it to be perfect. You can want connection without demanding that someone read your mind. You can aim for joy and still accept good enough when it comes. Because ironically, the more flexible your expectations, the more likely you are to feel pleasantly surprised instead of constantly underwhelmed. That's the paradox. Expect less, enjoy more, because you've stopped setting traps for your own happiness. The Ship of Theseus. Let's say there's a ship. It belongs to a guy named Theseus. Old school hero stuff. He sails it around, becomes famous, and eventually retires. His ship is a symbol of legacy. So the people decide to preserve it. Over time, parts of the ship start to rot. One plank is replaced, then another, then the sail, then the rudder. Years go by, and eventually, every single part has been swapped out. Here's the question: is it still the same ship? That's the paradox. This simple setup has been debated for over 2,000 years. It's called the Ship of Theseus, and it asks a deeper question. What makes something, or someone, the same, even after change? Now forget the boat for a second. Let's talk about you. You are constantly changing. Every cell in your body replaces itself over time. Your opinions evolve. Your habits shift. You've gone through heartbreak, phases, reinventions, quiet transitions. Are you still the same person you were 5 years ago? Technically, not a single part of you, physically or mentally, is exactly the same. And yet, you still say, me. You still carry your name. You still take responsibility for things you did when you were a totally different version of yourself. That's what makes this paradox so relatable. You're not just watching it from the outside. You are the ship. This idea isn't just philosophical, it's biological and psychological. Let's start with your body. According to biology, about 98% of the atoms in your body are replaced every year. Your skin renews itself every month. your skeleton completely regenerated every 10 years. So physically, you're already not who you used to be. Now let's talk about memory. Psychologists like Daniel Schachter have shown that memory is reconstructive. You don't store perfect memories. You rewrite them every time you recall them. That means your version of your past isn't static. It's constantly updated based on who you are now. Even personality isn't fixed. Studies have shown that people's core traits, like introversion or conscientiousness, shift across decades. According to one long-term study from the journal Psychological Science, people's personalities continue to evolve even into their 70s. So if everything about you is changing, what makes you you? Most people assume identity is a core, something inside you that never changes. But modern psychology suggests something else. Your identity is more like a narrative, a story you tell yourself about who you are. That story can stretch, adapt, even contradict itself, but it still gives you a sense of continuity. It's why you can look at an old photo and feel both recognition and distance. You remember being that person, even if you've clearly outgrown them. That feeling, that's the emotional version of the Ship of Theseus. You've replaced your parts, but somehow you're still you, because the story continued. Now let's apply this to real life. Ever run into someone you haven't seen in years? You realize how much they've changed, or how much you have. The friendship doesn't click like it used to. You both moved on, not dramatically, but slowly. And yet there's a weird tension. They still call you by the same nickname. They act like you're the same person, but you don't feel that way anymore. So what now? Do you correct them? Do you pretend? Or maybe think about how you've judged someone else for changing. They used to be fun. They used to be spontaneous. Now they're different, more serious, more quiet. And a part of you might feel like they've lost themselves. But what if they haven't? What if they're just a ship with new parts, still sailing, just on a different route? That's what this paradox forces you to see. Change doesn't always mean something is gone. Sometimes, it just means it kept going. You don't need to be who you were last year. You don't owe consistency to outdated versions of yourself. You're not betraying your identity by evolving. You're proving it's alive. The Ship of Theseus doesn't tell you what the true version is. It just asks what matters more, the parts or the journey. Because at some point, everything gets replaced. What stays is the direction, the purpose, the motion. You're not here to preserve every old piece. You're here to keep sailing. The Sorites Paradox. You sweep one grain of sand into a pile, not impressive. You add another, then another, still not a pile. At what point does it become a heap? 10 grains, 100, 1,000. Now reverse it. You have a large pile of sand. You take away one grain. It's still a heap. Remove another. Still a heap. But keep going, grain by grain, and eventually you're left with nothing. So when exactly did it stop being a heap? This is the Sorites Paradox, also called the paradox of the heap. It shows how small changes, when repeated, can completely transform something. But there's no clear point where the transformation happens. It sounds abstract at first, but this paradox applies to real life constantly. You don't gain 50 pounds overnight. You don't go broke in one day. You don't fall out of love after a single conversation. You don't burn out from one extra task. But these things happen. They creep up slowly, grain by grain. Each moment, each decision feels too small to matter. But added together, they become irreversible. And the problem is, because each step feels insignificant, you don't notice the change until it's already happened. That's what makes this paradox so relatable. The line between no big deal and too late is invisible. Let's look at how it works in different areas of life. Take health. You skip one workout. No big deal. You eat one late-night snack. Harmless. You stay up late one night. Feels normal. But do that 300 times, and suddenly, your energy is gone. You feel sluggish. You wonder what happened. What happened was nothing in particular. Just a long string of this won't hurt. Same with money. You spend $5 here, $10 there. You justify it. It's just coffee, just one delivery. But if you do that 20 times a month, you're down hundreds, and you don't know where it went. No single decision wrecked your budget, but together, they did. This is the Sorites Paradox in action. Tiny, almost invisible shifts, adding up to a huge change. Now flip it. Let's talk progress. You write one page of a book, doesn't feel like much. You go for one 10-minute walk, not impressive. You study for just 15 minutes, feels like it's not enough. So you tell yourself, why bother? But if you keep doing it, those small efforts pile up, and they do become something. The paradox works both ways. You build and destroy things the same way, gradually, then suddenly. Here's where it gets dangerous. Because change is so gradual, we start believing nothing is happening. You don't realize your relationship is in trouble, because each fight seems small. You don't notice your habits shifting until your days feel out of control. You don't realize how far you've drifted from your values, until you're forced to confront them all at once. That's the emotional punch of this paradox. Big things fall apart in tiny steps, and big things get built the same way. Psychologists use this idea when explaining incremental behavior change. In behavioral therapy, small habits are encouraged because they're doable, and over time, they stick. One concept called habit stacking shows that linking tiny behaviors together, brushing your teeth and doing 10 push-ups, for example, leads to lasting change. But most people give up before it accumulates, because they don't feel progress. That's the illusion. Each single grain looks meaningless. But they're not. We just don't feel the tipping point until we've already crossed it. The Sorites Paradox also plays a role in social behavior. Nobody becomes radicalized in one day. Nobody becomes toxic, dishonest, or manipulative overnight. It starts with small compromises, bending one rule, letting one thing slide. You do it enough times, and you wake up somewhere you never meant to be. So what do you take away from this? It's simple. Don't judge your actions based on how they feel in the moment. Judge them based on what they're adding up to. Are these grains of sand taking you somewhere you want to go? Are they building something, or slowly dissolving something that matters? You won't feel the shift every day, but you'll feel the result eventually. The good news is, small actions matter. And the bad news is, small actions matter. Heraclitus River. You can't step into the same river twice. That's what the philosopher Heraclitus said over 2,500 years ago, because by the time you step in again, the water has moved on. The current has shifted. The river is flowing, and so are you. This is Heraclitus' paradox, also known as the River Paradox. And it's not really about rivers, it's about change, constant, unstoppable, and often invisible. It asks a simple but disturbing question. If everything is always changing, can anything truly stay the same? Let's break it down. Imagine you walk through the same park every day, same trail, same trees, same bench. But in reality, it's not exactly the same. The leaves are different. The light changes. Maybe a branch has fallen. The grass is longer. You didn't notice most of it, but it changed anyway. And you weren't the same either. You had different thoughts, different energy, different priorities. That's the paradox. We live with the illusion of stability, but we're always changing, moment by moment, whether we see it or not. This isn't just philosophy. It's how your brain and body work. Your skin is regenerating. Your neurons are rewiring. Your thoughts and emotional patterns evolve with every experience, every conversation, every bit of information you take in. The version of you listening to this sentence is slightly different from the one who heard the last one. It's not poetic. It's biological. This has been supported in neuroscience. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, shows that even thinking different thoughts can physically reshape your brain over time. That means identity isn't fixed. It's fluid. You're more like a process than a thing. But if that's true, if everything is always in motion, What does it mean to be yourself? This is where Heraclitus River hits hardest, because on one hand, change is empowering. You're not stuck. You're not defined by who you were last year. You can evolve. But on the other hand, it's destabilizing. You can't hold still. Even the things you love, the people you trust, the beliefs that feel foundational, they shift over time. And the truth is, we resist that. We crave continuity. We want to believe that something is constant, our identity, our relationships, our purpose. So we create narratives. You say, I've always been like this, or they've never changed. But those are simplifications. They're not lies. They're just easier to live with. Because if we admitted how fast everything shifts, we'd have to question everything. Our goals, our commitments, even our memories. Think about friendships. You might have a best friend from high school. You reconnect years later, and it's just not the same. They're not better or worse, just different. And so are you. The river moved. Think about your passions. Something you used to care deeply about, maybe a sport, a hobby, a cause, doesn't hit the same now. You didn't make a decision to quit. It just faded. Your river flowed elsewhere. Or think about identity, a job title, a role in the family, a belief system. You built your sense of self around it, but then something changed. And now you're not sure who you are without it. This is how people end up in crisis. Not because they broke, but because they changed and didn't know how to update the story. Heraclitus' paradox reminds us that life doesn't pause, even when we want it to. You can't go back to how things were, because how things were is already gone. So what do you do with that? You let go of permanence. You stop expecting things, or people, to stay exactly as they are. You start building your life not on fixed traits, but on direction. You stop asking, who am I, exactly, and start asking, who am I, becoming, and does that path feel honest? Because identity is less like a photograph and more like a video. You don't freeze it, you follow it, and sometimes that's the only clarity you get. Heraclitus didn't mean that nothing matters. He meant that everything is motion, so meaning comes from how you move with it. You won't be the same next year. Your relationships won't be the same. The river keeps flowing, but if you pay attention, you can choose the current. The paradox of tolerance. Let's say you believe in being open-minded. You think people should be allowed to say what they believe. You support free speech. You try to accept different viewpoints, even if you disagree. Tolerance feels like a virtue, and it is. It makes peaceful societies possible. It allows people to coexist across cultures, religions, and politics. But here's where the trouble starts. What happens when someone uses your tolerance to promote intolerance? What if someone enters the conversation not to share ideas, but to destroy the conversation itself? This is the paradox of tolerance, first introduced by philosopher Karl Popper in 1945. He argued that if a society is tolerant without limits, its ability to be tolerant will eventually be destroyed by the intolerant. It sounds backwards at first. Shouldn't tolerance mean tolerating everything? But Popper's point was clear. Tolerating those who seek to eliminate tolerance leads to intolerance winning. Let's make it real. Imagine a public forum, a place where anyone can speak. Most people use it to exchange ideas, but then someone steps in and says certain groups shouldn't be allowed to speak. Or worse, those people shouldn't exist. Now, the group has a problem. Do they let that person talk because they're committed to free speech? Or do they remove that person and get accused of being intolerant? It's not just a philosophical dilemma, it's a power strategy. Extremist groups throughout history, fascists, cult leaders, authoritarian movements, have used the language of tolerance to gain access and visibility. They say, let us speak, but once they gain influence, they shut down everyone else's right to speak. This happened in Germany in the 1930s. Hitler didn't take power by force. He took power through a democratic system that tolerated his rhetoric until it was too late. That's why Popper said, we must be intolerant of intolerance, not to be authoritarian, but to protect the very thing that makes freedom possible. Now let's apply this paradox outside politics. Think about a workplace. You want a culture where people can voice their ideas. But then one person starts mocking others during meetings. They dismiss different viewpoints. They dominate the conversation. If you tolerate them because everyone deserves a voice, you send a message. You can silence others as long as you speak loud enough, and soon the quiet voices leave. The open dialogue dies. You've tolerated your way into censorship, just not the kind you expected. Same thing can happen in friend groups, families, or online spaces. You might think you're being fair by letting everyone speak their mind, but if you don't draw the line somewhere, the loudest, most aggressive, most disrespectful people take over, and the people who value respect stop showing up. This doesn't mean you should silence people for having different views. The paradox isn't about shutting down disagreement. It's about knowing the difference between disagreement and destruction. Popper made a distinction between ideas that challenge norms and ideas that seek to eliminate the possibility of disagreement entirely. One is debate, the other is sabotage. So how do you manage this? You define your boundaries early. You make it clear that free speech isn't the same as freedom from consequences. You protect disagreement, but not disrespect. You allow criticism, but not cruelty. You tolerate voices that want to contribute, but not voices that want to silence, dehumanize, or dominate. This isn't easy, especially today, where cancel culture, free speech, and platforming are constant flashpoints. It's easy to look like the villain, whether you allow everything or shut something down. But that's exactly why this paradox matters. Because no society, no group, no friendship, no team can survive if it lets people exploit its openness to destroy openness itself. Tolerance isn't weakness, but indiscriminate tolerance is. The self-deception paradox. You lie to yourself, not because you're dishonest, but because sometimes it's the only way to function. You tell yourself, it's not a big deal, I'm fine, this time will be different. And on some level, you know those things might not be true, but you still believe them, at least partially, because if you didn't, things would feel worse. That's the paradox. We know we're lying to ourselves, and yet we still believe the lie. This is the self-deception paradox. The idea that your brain can both know and not know the truth at the same time, and function better because of it. It's strange, but also extremely common. You've probably seen this in other people. A friend stays in a relationship that's clearly one-sided. They make excuses. They're just going through something. They'll change. They didn't mean it. Part of them probably knows those aren't solid reasons. But believing them gives them hope. And without that hope, they might collapse emotionally. So the lie becomes useful. But this isn't just about emotional protection. There's research behind it too. Psychologist Shelley Taylor studied what she called positive illusions, the way people maintain overly optimistic views of themselves, their control, and their future. She found that people with mild self-deception actually tend to have better mental health. They cope with stress more effectively. They recover faster from setbacks. They feel more confident, and that confidence sometimes becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. In contrast, people with brutally accurate self-perception, those who always see the cold, hard truth, are more prone to anxiety and depression. That's not to say delusion is good, but it shows that some amount of self-deception might be adaptive, even healthy. So how does this work? How can you believe something that you also kind of know isn't true? Cognitive scientists call it compartmentalization. You isolate the uncomfortable truth in one mental box and keep living from another. You don't eliminate the doubt, you just avoid it. You might ignore warning signs in your job, relationship, or health, not because you're unaware, but because acknowledging them would force change, and change feels overwhelming. So your brain protects you by creating a story that lets you stay where you are, or take denial. Someone's loved one dies. They continue setting a plate at dinner. They keep expecting the phone to ring. They say, it doesn't feel real. That's not irrational. It's their mind, buffering them from grief. They can't handle all at once. It's not about logic. It's about survival. Self-deception isn't limited to crisis. It shows up in small, daily ways too. You buy something expensive, and justify it with fake logic. You tell yourself you're just resting when you're actually procrastinating. You say, "I'm over it," when your body language says otherwise. And what's fascinating is, you usually know you're doing it, but you go along with the lie anyway. That's the paradox in full. You are both liar and believer. And somehow that split keeps you stable. But it's not without cost. The more you deceive yourself, the more you disconnect from reality. Over time, those illusions can backfire. You stay in the wrong job for too long. You invest in a relationship that's going nowhere. You ignore health problems until they become serious, because even if the lie protects you, your reality doesn't stop just because you ignore it. So the challenge becomes this: how much truth can you handle without breaking? And how much deception can you carry without losing yourself? There's no perfect answer. You can't live with full honesty all the time. It would be exhausting. But you can't lie to yourself forever either. At some point, the cost catches up. The best approach: use self-deception as a temporary bridge, not a permanent home. Let it help you get through hard moments. Let it soften the edges. But eventually, walk toward the truth, even if it's slow, even if it hurts. Because healing, growth, and change don't come from pretending. They come from facing what's real when you're ready. That's what makes this paradox so human. The mirror paradox. There's a teenager standing in front of a mirror. They tilt their head, fix their hair, squint at their skin. They don't love what they see, but it's familiar. They've seen this version of themselves 1,000 times. This is what they think they look like. Later, someone takes a candid photo. The teen looks at it and thinks, "Wait, is that really me? I look weird." That reaction is surprisingly common, and it leads straight into one of the most relatable paradoxes of modern life: the mirror paradox. The fact that you've never actually seen yourself as others see you. And what's more, the version of you that you think is most accurate usually isn't. Let's break it down. What you see in the mirror is a flipped image. Left is right. Right is left. It's subtle, but important, because you're used to this reversed version. You've spent your whole life staring at it. It becomes your standard. So when you see yourself in a photo, which shows your true orientation, your brain says, "That's off." It feels unfamiliar, even wrong. That's called the mere exposure effect, a psychological principle that says we're more comfortable with what we see most often. Even if it's less accurate, the mirror version feels more like you than the version others actually see. That disconnect is the starting point. But the paradox runs deeper than image, because the same thing happens with your personality, your tone, your habits, even your emotional energy. You live inside your own head. You know your thoughts, your intentions, your fears, but other people don't. They only see what's on the outside: your posture, your voice, your word choices, your timing, and what they see doesn't always line up with what you feel. You might think you're being quiet to be respectful. They think you're cold. You might think you're being confident. They see arrogance. You feel anxious and unsure. They think you're distant or disinterested. This is the core of the mirror paradox. There's a permanent mismatch between how you experience yourself and how others experience you. And the really tricky part: neither one is fully correct, but both versions are real. This shows up constantly in daily life. Let's say you get nervous during presentations. Your hands shake. You feel like your voice is trembling. You think it's obvious to everyone, but research shows that people usually don't notice nearly as much as you think. This is known as the illusion of transparency, a bias where you assume others can see your internal state clearly, when in reality, they can't. Same goes for confidence. You might be quiet because you're overthinking every word, but others think you're calm and in control. Your intention doesn't always match their perception. This also shows up in relationships. You feel like you're being emotionally available. You listen, you respond, you try to be present, but your partner says you feel distant. They're not reacting to your inner world. They're reacting to your energy, your facial expression, your timing, your body language. Stuff you don't even realize you're projecting. This gap between how I think I'm coming across and how I'm actually received is the exact spot where most communication breaks down. Even worse, we build our identity based on our internal self-image, but most of our feedback comes from the external version others are reacting to. So if someone calls you too much or cold or unapproachable, it can feel completely wrong. Not because they're lying, but because they're interacting with a version of you that you don't fully see. And if that happens enough, you start to feel misunderstood, judged, isolated, even when you're trying your best to be understood. So what do you do with that? You don't throw out your self-image, but you stop treating it as complete. You start factoring in feedback, not blindly, but honestly. This is where tools like 360 feedback, therapy, or just plain asking people, how do I come across when I'm stressed? Or what's one thing I do that I might not notice, become incredibly valuable. You'll learn things that surprise you, and sometimes those insights will hurt, but they'll help you grow faster than any mirror ever could, because the mirror shows you symmetry, but the world shows you impact, and impact is what really defines your presence. That's the paradox.
You'll never see yourself the way others do.
But you can choose to look beyond the mirror. When you can hold both pair, you feel inside, and how you're seen from the outside. That's when real self-awareness begins. The paradox of self-improvement. You want to be better, smarter, calmer, stronger, more confident. Whatever it is, you're working on it. You read books. You set goals. You try to upgrade the way you think, feel, and live. But somewhere along the way, something strange happens. The more you focus on improving yourself, the more broken you start to feel. That's the paradox of self-improvement. The desire to become better can make you feel worse because it reinforces the belief that you're not enough as you are. Let's break that down. Imagine you set a goal to become more productive. You plan your week. You try a new habit tracker. You get through most of it, but not everything. Instead of feeling proud, you feel like a failure. You were more organized than last week, but you're now hyper-aware of how far you still have to go. This is incredibly common, because self-improvement often starts with a question like, what's wrong with me, and how do I fix it? That framing sounds motivating, but it carries a hidden cost. It implies that you, as you are right now, are a problem. And the more you chase improvement from that mindset, the more you confirm the narrative that you're not okay yet. You start defining yourself by the gap between who you are and who you want to be, instead of by the progress you've already made. That's not just a feeling, it's measurable. In psychology, this shows up in a concept called self-discrepancy theory. Developed by E. Torrey Higgins, the theory explains how we experience emotional discomfort when there's a gap between our actual self and our ideal self. The bigger the gap, the more we feel guilt, frustration, or shame. Ironically, even as you get closer to your goals, the act of constantly measuring the gap keeps you feeling behind. Now think about this in your day-to-day life. You go to the gym, not to celebrate your strength, but because you think your body isn't good enough. You study, not out of curiosity, but because you're afraid of looking stupid. You try to be kinder, not because it feels right, but because you hate how impatient you are. Improvement becomes punishment. Progress becomes pressure, and the finish line keeps moving. That's what makes this paradox so hard to spot. It hides inside good intentions. You think you're building yourself up, but in reality, you're just getting better at noticing your flaws. Here's another layer. We live in a culture obsessed with optimization. Sleep better, eat cleaner, be more mindful, meditate, journal, wake up at 5 a.m. All of these can be helpful in moderation, but when self-improvement becomes constant self-monitoring, it crosses a line. You stop growing, you start chasing, and chasing never ends. There's always a new technique, a better routine, a higher standard. So you never feel done, you never feel good enough, you just feel behind. That's the trap. The more you build your identity around improvement, the more your identity depends on the idea that you're broken. And if you start to feel okay, that inner voice panics. It says, don't relax, you're not done, you're just being lazy. So what do? You don't stop improving. but you shift while you're doing it. Instead of fixing what's broken, you build on what's already working. You approach growth with self-respect, not self-rejection. This is what researchers call self-compassion-based motivation. Studies show that when people set goals from a place of kindness, rather than criticism, they're more likely to succeed, less likely to burn out, and feel better along the way. That's because compassion doesn't lower your standards. It just changes the voice in your head from "you're a mess" to "you're worth the effort." That shift is everything. It lets you rest without guilt. It lets you fail without collapse. It lets you grow without hating who you used to be. If every step forward is built on the belief that you're not enough, you'll never feel enough, no matter how far you go. But if every step is built on the belief that you deserve to grow, you'll carry confidence with you. That's the paradox. Improvement is good, but only if it's not based on the idea that you need to earn your worth. The identity paradox. Let's talk about identity. You're told to be yourself, to stand out, to not care what anyone thinks. But at the same time, you're told to fit in, to be professional, to be likable, to not be too much. So you try to be unique, but not weird. You try to be confident, but not arrogant. You try to be real, but only the version that's socially acceptable. That's the identity paradox. We want to be fully ourselves, but we also want to be accepted. And sometimes, those two things feel like they're in conflict. This isn't just a personality issue. It's a daily tension that plays out in small, quiet moments. You walk into a new room, a new job, a new friend group, a new community dearly, and immediately you start scanning. What kind of person belongs here? And without realizing it, you adjust. You downplay the things that make you different. You highlight the parts that will blend in. You become a version of yourself that's safe and strategic. This instinct is human. Psychologists call it impression management, the act of shaping your behavior based on how you want to be seen. It's not always fake, it's just adaptive. We all do it. But over time, if you're not careful, you start to forget where the real you ends and the curated version begins. You start asking, wait, do I actually like this? Or do I like that people like me for it? Am I saying this because I believe it? Or because it fits the role I've been playing? That's where identity starts to blur, and it creates this weird emotional confusion. You feel like you're not being true to yourself, but you also feel afraid to be too different, too honest, too visible, because deep down, you want to belong. And the parts of you that feel hardest to share, your insecurities, your weird opinions, your real background, those are the same parts you assume will push people away. So you filter, you smooth the edges, you trade authenticity for acceptance. It doesn't happen all at once, it's gradual. But eventually, you wake up feeling like, I don't know who I am, when I'm not trying to impress anyone. This isn't just a social thing. It happens professionally too. Maybe you took a job because it made sense. You got good at it. You built a reputation. But deep down, it's not what you care about. Still, you keep going because it's who people expect you to be. The paradox shows up again. You want to honor your true self, but your current self is wrapped in obligations, expectations, and momentum. Now here's where it gets more complicated. We often assume identity is found, like it's a core waiting to be discovered. But modern psychology says identity is more like something we build, over time, through choices and context. It's not just who you are, it's also who you've become, who you pretend to be, and who you're afraid to admit you are. And that means it's constantly shifting. A study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that identity feels most stable when there's consistency over time and across situations. But in reality, most people act differently at work, at home, with friends, or online. You don't lie, you just show different versions of yourself. And that's the kicker. Every version is real, but no single version tells the full story. So what do? You start by recognizing that identity doesn't have to be rigid. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. You don't have to choose between being yourself and being accepted. What matters is alignment. Are you compromising your values, or just adjusting your style? Are you hiding something that matters, or just being socially smart? You can belong without disappearing. You can grow without performing. You can shape your identity without faking it. But it requires regular check-ins, not with your followers, not with your boss, with yourself. Does this version of me feel honest? Am I living in a way that makes me proud or just approved? That's the real work of identity. That's the paradox. You're always becoming yourself, and that process never fully ends. The freedom paradox. You grow up thinking freedom is the goal, the ability to do what you want, to choose your path, to make your own rules. And at first, that's true. You fight for independence. You break away from the rules that felt too strict. You want options, flexibility, autonomy. But then something strange happens. The more freedom you have, the harder it becomes to feel satisfied. You have more choices, but more anxiety, more flexibility, but less direction, more space, but a growing sense of emptiness. That's the freedom paradox. Total freedom doesn't always make you feel more free. Sometimes it makes you feel lost. Let's break it down. Imagine you're handed the perfect menu, hundreds of items, every food you could ever want. At first, it's exciting, but then it becomes overwhelming. What if you pick the wrong thing? What if there's something better? You hesitate, you second guess, you make a choice, but you don't enjoy it because you're still wondering what else you could have had. That's not about food, it's about life. Modern life offers more freedom than ever. You can live anywhere, work remotely, change careers, swipe through hundreds of potential partners, watch anything, learn anything, post anything. But instead of making people happier, many are more anxious, more indecisive, more lonely. Why? Because freedom without purpose feels like floating. It's directionless. Psychologist Barry Schwartz calls this the paradox of choice. When we have too many options, our satisfaction drops, not because the options are bad, but because we feel the pressure to pick the perfect one. And if we don't feel 100% amazing about our choice, we blame ourselves. We could have chosen differently. We had all the freedom, so we think we must have failed. Freedom becomes pressure, and pressure kills joy. But there's another layer. With total freedom, you also lose something else. Structure. Think about this. A blank canvas seems exciting until you have to paint on it. Too much space. No limits. No direction. It's paralyzing. That's why artists, creators, and even entrepreneurs often create constraints for themselves. Not because they want less freedom, but because limits help focus energy. This is supported by research in behavioral science. People are often more creative and productive when given clear boundaries and constraints. Structure provides clarity, and clarity helps motivation. Now let's apply this to identity. If you can be anyone, then who are you? If you can live any lifestyle, which one is the right one? Without some internal compass, freedom just turns into noise. This is what Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, described in his work. He said that what humans need isn't just freedom, but freedom tied to meaning. When freedom has no purpose, it creates anxiety. When it's attached to meaning, it creates direction. So, what does that look like? Let's say you have the freedom to work any job. You could chase money, or passion, or stability. But if you don't know what you value, every option feels equally empty. Or in relationships, you can date anyone. There are apps, communities, choices everywhere. But without knowing what you want in love, in connection, in family, you just end up swiping forever. Too many doors, not enough anchors. That's the paradox. We think more freedom means more happiness, but it only works when you know what to do with it. So, what's the answer? Not to get rid of freedom, but to choose your constraints, to build a life where your choices are guided, not by pressure to keep all options open, but by clarity around what actually matters to you. Freedom feels better when you narrow the path with intention. You say no to things. You create habits. You stick with something long enough to feel depth, not just novelty. That's not restriction. That's freedom with direction. The kind that leads somewhere. The kind that feels grounded. The value paradox. You don't notice the thing that matters most until it's gone. It might be a person, a routine, your health, a normal day, something you once thought of as basic, boring, or guaranteed. But the moment it disappears, suddenly, it's priceless. That's the value paradox. We rarely value something while we have it, but deeply miss it once it's gone. This isn't about material things. It's about familiarity, about how the mind adapts to good things so quickly that we stop seeing them at all. Take relationships. You might see someone every day. A partner, a friend, a parent. They check in, they show up, they help in little ways. You get used to it. You start assuming they'll always be there, and then something shifts. They move away. You grow apart. They stop calling, or in the worst case, they pass away. And suddenly, everything they did, the boring, routine, everyday things, becomes emotional, beautiful, sacred, not because they changed, but because your awareness did. This is hedonic adaptation in action, a well-researched psychological phenomenon. It means we get used to good things quickly, whether it's a new job, a raise, a relationship, or better health. Donneur, your brain adjusts. What once felt exciting becomes normal, and when something is normal, it becomes invisible. You stop noticing it, you stop appreciating it, until it's gone, and then it hurts. This isn't just emotional, it's neurological. Studies show that the brain's reward system lights up when something is new. But over time, the same stimulus brings less excitement. That's why the first day in a new apartment feels amazing. Then 6 months later, it's just where you live. You adapt. You always adapt. But that's the danger. Because when you stop seeing what you have, you stop valuing it. And when you stop valuing it, you might neglect it, take it for granted, push it away. Then later, when it's no longer there, you feel guilt. You think, I didn't realize how good I had it, but you did have it. You just weren't paying attention. This paradox shows up in all parts of life. You don't value your free time until your schedule gets out of control. You don't appreciate your quiet mornings until you have kids. You don't realize how much peace you had in your old job until you land in a high-paying one that drains you. Even your own body becomes invisible until something breaks. A sore back, a broken wrist, a hospital visit. Suddenly, you miss being pain-free, a state you never even thought to appreciate before. And here's the real punchline. You can't go back and re-experience those moments, but you can remember what it felt like to overlook them and use that memory to notice what you still have. Because right now, today, there's probably something in your life that feels ordinary that your future self will desperately wish they could return to. So how do you stop the cycle? Not by trying to feel constant gratitude. That's impossible. You can't walk around all day worshipping your coffee or your working knees, but you can slow down enough to notice, to say, out loud, in your head, in writing, this is good, this matters. I'm lucky to have this. It won't make you immune to loss, but it will build awareness, and that awareness turns into appreciation, even if it's quiet. Because value isn't always loud. It doesn't show up as fireworks. It shows up as consistency, presence, familiarity, things that don't demand your attention, but shape your life. That's the paradox. We chase what we don't have, and ignore what we already do, Sorites, until it's gone. The Knowability Paradox. We like to think that truth is out there, waiting to be discovered, that with the right tools, enough time, and enough effort, we can know everything that's knowable. But here's the unsettling part. What if the belief that all truths can be known leads to the conclusion that some truths must remain unknowable? That's the Knowability Paradox, and it sits at the heart of philosophy, logic, and human curiosity. It says, if every truth is, in theory, knowable, but not all truths are known, then there must exist truths that are unknowable. That might sound like a language trick, but it has real consequences, especially in how we think about science, religion, politics, and even everyday decisions. Let's break it down. The paradox was first formally stated by philosophers Friedrich Fichte and Jaakko Hintikka in the 1960s. It builds on modal logic, the logic of possibility and necessity. The key idea is this: If you say, every truth is knowable, you're saying that, even if we don't know something now, we could know it eventually. But here's where things get tricky. If we assume that some truths are never actually known, then at least one truth must be both true, but permanently unknowable. Because if we could know it, someone eventually would. And that contradicts the original statement that every truth is knowable. So you're stuck. Either every truth is knowable, but then it follows that all truths are eventually known, which clearly isn't true, or you admit. Some truths are unknowable. That alone is mind-bending, but it becomes even more real when we apply it to life. Let's start with science. We like to believe that science can eventually explain everything, but quantum mechanics, for example, introduces fundamental limits to what we can observe. You can't measure a particle's position and momentum precisely at the same time. That's not a technological limitation. It's a law of physics, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. It tells us that some truths are beyond observation, not because we're lazy, but because the universe doesn't allow both answers at once. Same goes for the idea of multiverses. If there are alternate versions of reality, timelines we can never access, then those truths might be forever beyond us, no matter how smart we get. Now take this into personal life. Think of people you've known who've passed away. There are questions you'll never get to ask, intentions you'll never fully understand, feelings they might have had that you'll never know for sure. Those are emotional unknowables. You live with half-truths. You build closure around incomplete understanding because the full truth simply isn't accessible anymore. Or think about someone you love. You'll never fully know what it's like to be them. No matter how long you talk, no matter how deeply you connect, there will always be pieces of their inner world that remain private, hidden, or even unknown to themselves. That's not a failure. That's part of being human. We operate as if total understanding is the goal. But in practice, we live in a constant state of partial knowing. And here's what's wild. The more you know, the more aware you become of what you don't. The deeper your understanding of the world, the more vast the unknown seems. Philosopher Karl Popper once said, "Our knowledge can only be finite, while our ignorance must necessarily be infinite." So what do you do with that? Not give up on truth, not stop asking questions, but let go of the idea that you'll ever get to some final, complete, perfect understanding of the universe, of other people, or even yourself. And knowing that you can't know everything isn't weakness, it's wisdom. That's the paradox. If every truth could be known, then some truths, by definition, would never be known. And maybe the point isn't to solve every mystery. Maybe it's to live with curiosity, humility, and enough peace to accept what you'll never fully see. The Raven Paradox. You want to know if a theory is true. So you test it. You collect evidence. You try to confirm the rule. Let's say someone claims all ravens are black. Sounds reasonable. You go outside, spot a black raven, and think, yep, that supports the theory. You find another black raven. More evidence. 10 black ravens. Great. So far, so good. But here's where things get weird. According to logic, if all ravens are black is true, then the statement, all non-black things are not ravens, must also be true. That's the contrapositive. It means the two statements are logically identical. So if you see a green apple, something that is not black and not a raven, you've technically gathered evidence that all ravens are black.
Wait, what?
How does a green apple tell you anything about ravens? That's the Raven Paradox, and it messes with how we think about evidence, logic, and confirmation. Let's slow it down. The original form of the paradox comes from philosopher Karl Hempel in the 1940s. He was exploring the logic of confirmation, how we verify universal claims like all X are Y. In theory, every time you see something that doesn't contradict the statement, you're supporting it. So a black raven supports all ravens are black. And weirdly, a white shoe also supports that statement because it's not a raven and it's not black. That's logically consistent, but intuitively, it feels ridiculous. This paradox reveals a real-world tension between formal logic and how humans think, because in logic, Evidence is just about eliminating contradictions. But in real life, we care about relevant evidence. A green apple doesn't help you confirm anything about birds, and yet, if you follow the rules of pure logic, it counts. So how do we make sense of this? Well, in practice, scientists and most people don't treat all confirming cases equally. We value evidence that's informative, unexpected, or specific to the claim. That's why finding another black raven feels meaningful. It directly tests the hypothesis. It narrows the space of uncertainty. Seeing a white sneaker doesn't narrow anything. It's irrelevant, even if technically valid. This ties into a bigger issue in real life. We often mistake volume of evidence for quality of evidence. You can find 1,000 things that don't contradict a belief, but only a few that truly test it. Think about online arguments. Someone makes a claim. Then they post 20 memes, 10 unrelated news articles, and one graph from 2003. They say, "I'm right." But how many of those actually test the claim directly? How many just feel supportive because they don't obviously go against it? That's the Raven Paradox in disguise. It also shows up in personal life. You assume your friend is reliable. You remember the times they showed up. You forget the times they didn't, or explain them away. You focus on the black ravens and ignore everything else. We do this with our worldviews too. We believe a political or spiritual idea and surround ourselves with confirming inputs. We see evidence everywhere, but rarely stop to ask if we're gathering meaningful evidence or just collecting green apples. That's the real insight here. Not that logic is broken, but that logical consistency doesn't always equal useful reasoning. Good thinking isn't just about stacking confirmations. It's about asking what kind of observation would actually change my mind. And then am I willing to go looking for it? Because confirmation is easy. You can always find things that agree with you, or at least don't contradict you. But disconfirmation, that's where truth lives. The Raven Paradox is a reminder that not all evidence is created equal, and just because something fits the frame, doesn't mean it sharpens the picture. The brain in a vat. Imagine this. You wake up in the morning, drink your coffee, check your phone, go to work, talk to people, feel stressed, feel proud, fall asleep. Seems normal. But what if none of it was real? What if everything you see, hear, feel, even your body, is part of a simulation? What if your brain is floating in a vat of nutrients, hooked up to a computer that feeds you fake sensory input? You'd have no way of knowing, because all your experiences, even your thoughts, would be generated inside that system. That's the brain in a vat paradox, and it asks a brutal question. If all of our knowledge comes through senses, and senses can be faked, how can we ever know what's real? Let's break it down. The idea traces back to philosopher René Descartes in the 1600s. He asked, what if an evil demon is deceiving me, making me think the world exists when it doesn't? The modern version replaces the demon with a computer, but the core is the same. What if reality is an illusion, and you're just a brain being fed lies? That might sound like sci-fi, like The Matrix. But it's not just fiction, it's a serious philosophical challenge. Because most of what you know, the colors, the voices, the sense of space and time, all comes through sensory data. And if that data can be simulated, then technically, you could be wrong about everything. Here's why it's so unsettling. You can't step outside the illusion to check. Because if you're a brain in a vat, then everything including your memory, logic, even doubt, is part of the simulation. So even asking, is this real, might be something the computer wants you to ask. Now, does this mean we should stop trusting everything? Not exactly. Most philosophers treat this as a thought experiment, not a literal fear, but a way to test the limits of knowledge. It forces us to confront how much we assume versus how much we know. And in day-to-day life, we make these assumptions constantly. You assume your memories are accurate. V as a vor, even though studies show that human memory is easily distorted. You assume people see the world like you do, even though perception is shaped by culture, trauma, language, and bias. So even if you're not in a vat, you're still in a kind of mental filter, a limited, personalized version of reality. And that leads to another layer of the paradox. Even if you're not in a simulation, your brain still constructs your reality. The world you experience is not raw data, it's processed. Your eyes only see a narrow band of light. Your ears only hear certain frequencies. Your brain fills in gaps, filters distractions, and creates a smooth narrative so you can function. And it works, most of the time. But it's not perfect, and it's not objective. So even if you're not being manipulated by a machine, you're still being shaped by a brain that interprets, distorts, and guesses. That's where the paradox gets personal. Because if your reality is brain-dependent, then how do you distinguish between truth and perception, between what's really happening and what you think is happening? You can't totally escape your brain, but you can get better at questioning it. That's why practices like meditation, critical thinking, therapy, or even simple reflection matter. They help you observe the process, not just the content. They help you ask, is this feeling based on facts or just fear? Is this belief mine, or did I absorb it from somewhere else? Is this memory accurate or just emotionally charged? Because the vat might not be literal, but mental filters are very real. And in a world full of algorithmic feeds, echo chambers, and digital realities, you don't need to be hooked to a computer to live in a simulation. Sometimes, the simulation is social or cultural or psychological. The point isn't to panic about what's real. It's to stay aware that your reality is only one version, and it's shaped by systems you rarely question. The observer effect. You think watching something means being passive. You're just observing. You're not touching it, not interfering. But what if the very act of watching something changes it? That's the observer effect. The idea that the act of observation can alter the thing being observed. And it's not just metaphor. It's one of the most famous phenomena in quantum physics, and one of the most misunderstood in daily life. Let's start with where it began. In quantum mechanics, particles like electrons don't act like tiny balls. They behave more like probabilities, waves of possible outcomes. But here's the twist. When you try to measure a particle's position just to see where it is, you force it to choose a location. The wave of possibilities collapses into one definite outcome. In other words, by observing the particle, you change its behavior. This was famously demonstrated in the double-slit experiment, where light and matter seem to act like both particles and waves. But the moment you observe which slit they go through, the pattern changes. Reality behaves differently when it knows you're looking. Now, most people take that idea and turn it into magical thinking. If I look at my life differently, I'll change it. Or my thoughts create reality. But the true power of the observer effect isn't mystical. It's psychological. It's about how much influence we have just by paying attention. Think about it in daily life. A teacher walks into the classroom. The students sit up straighter. You start tracking your food intake. You eat more consciously. You tell someone, I'm watching you, and they change their behavior. Observation isn't neutral. It creates pressure. It introduces self-awareness. It makes people and systems behave differently. And that includes you. Have you ever noticed how hard it is to act natural when you know someone's filming you? Or how your voice changes when you're being recorded? You become the observer and the observed. And the feedback loop messes with your instincts. Now here's the deeper layer. You also observe yourself. You watch your thoughts, you judge your actions, you narrate your life in real time. And that internal observer, the voice in your head, isn't always kind. Sometimes it makes you self-conscious. You overthink, you rehearse, you hesitate. You can't just live because you're constantly monitoring how you look, sound, or come across. The result? You behave differently. Not because you want to, but because you're being observed. Even if it's only in your own mind. This is why things like journaling, therapy, or even just talking out loud can be so transformative. They let you observe your own experience in a new way. And once you observe it, it often shifts. A thought that felt overwhelming becomes smaller when you write it down. A habit you never noticed starts to fade once you track it. A belief you've carried for years starts to wobble when you say it out loud and hear how it sounds. Observation creates awareness, and awareness creates the possibility of change. Here, this isn't just theory, it's backed by research. Behavioral studies have shown that self-monitoring, like tracking exercise, moods, or habits, can significantly improve follow-through and results. Not because people suddenly have more willpower, but because observation makes things visible, and what's visible becomes addressable. You can't fix what you don't see, but once you see it, it doesn't stay the same. That's the paradox. Observation feels passive, but it's deeply active. Watching something doesn't just reflect reality, it shapes it. And maybe that's why mindfulness matters. Not because it changes the world directly, but because it changes how you observe your experience. And that alone is powerful. So whether it's a particle, a person, or a painful thought, the moment you pay attention to it, it begins to shift. Plato's cave. Imagine this. You're born inside a dark cave. You're chained in place, facing a wall. Behind you is a fire, and between the fire and your back, people walk by holding up shapes and objects. You can't turn around. All you've ever seen are the shadows on the wall in front of you. That's your reality. That's your truth. That's the only world you know. Then one day, you break free. You turn around. You see the fire. You see the people. You see the shapes. And eventually, you step outside the cave. For the first time, you see the sun. You see real trees, real colors, real depth. It's overwhelming, painful at first. But slowly, you realize the shadows were never the whole story. That's Plato's cave, and it's one of the oldest and most powerful paradoxes in philosophy. The core idea is simple. What if everything you think is real is only a shadow of a deeper truth you've never seen? And here's the scary part. The person inside the cave doesn't know they're inside the cave. They think the shadows are reality. So when someone tries to explain what's outside, it sounds crazy. And if that person ever goes back into the cave to share what they've seen, the others laugh or get angry. They don't want their worldview disrupted, because that's not just uncomfortable, it's threatening. Now take that metaphor and apply it to everyday life. You grow up with a certain version of the world. Maybe it's shaped by your family, your country, your religion, your education. You're told what's good, what's true, what matters. You're taught how to behave, how to think, how to live, and most of it works, until something doesn't add up. Maybe you experience something that contradicts what you were taught. Maybe you meet someone who sees the world completely differently. Maybe you read, travel, suffer, love, and your perspective shifts, and suddenly, your shadows aren't enough anymore. The stories you believed start to feel thin. The truths you memorized feel shaky. The version of reality you once trusted feels small. But stepping outside that mental cave is hard. It means letting go of certainty. It means admitting you were wrong, or at least incomplete. It means accepting that other people might not join you, and you might not be able to go back. That's what makes this paradox so real. The more you grow, the harder it becomes to fit back into your old world. You see this in people who've left toxic belief systems, in those who've outgrown small communities, in anyone who's started asking uncomfortable questions and realized the answers don't live on the wall anymore. You can't unsee the fire. You can't pretend the sun doesn't exist. But sometimes you still miss the comfort of the shadows. Here's where it gets even trickier. Just because you've stepped out of one cave doesn't mean you're free from all of them, because truth has layers. You might escape one illusion, only to get stuck in a bigger one. You might think, I've woken up, I see clearly now, but you're still limited by your context, your language, your mental biases. So the deeper truth is this: we're all still in caves. Some are just more complex, more sophisticated, better lit. And the wisest people aren't the ones who say, I found the truth. They're the ones who say, I know I'm still working my way out. This connects to modern ideas too. Social media creates its own caves, algorithmic walls showing you the same shadows over and over, echo chambers, filter bubbles, personalized illusions. It feels real, but is it the full picture? Plato's cave isn't about being cynical. It's about staying curious. It's about staying curious. It's about remembering that what you see is a version of reality, not reality itself. That's the paradox. What feels true might only be a shadow, and stepping into the light means letting go of what once felt like everything. The simulation argument. Here's a question that sounds like science fiction, but is taken seriously by scientists, philosophers, and tech leaders around the world. What if we're living in a simulation? Not metaphorically, not in a philosophical sense. Literally, what if everything you see, feel, and remember is just code running inside some advanced computer system? This is the simulation argument. And it's not just a theory, it's a paradox. Because the deeper you go, the more it forces you to question if it's possible to simulate reality so perfectly that you can't tell the difference. Then how would you ever know if your world is real or not? Let's break it down. This idea was made famous by philosopher Nick Bostrom in the early 2000s. His argument was logical, not mystical, and it went like this. If humanity survives long enough to develop advanced computing power, then eventually we'd have the ability to simulate entire universes, including conscious beings inside them. And if that happens, there could be billions of simulated worlds for everyone real, one. So statistically, what are the chances that we happen to be in the original base reality? Think of it like this. If one real civilization creates 1,000 realistic video game simulations and each one contains conscious characters who believe they're real, then most beings like you wouldn't be in the original world. They'd be in a simulation. And by those odds, so would you. Now here's where the paradox comes in. If we could prove we're in a simulation, wouldn't that require us to step outside of it? But if everything, your brain, your instruments, your science, is part of the simulation, then even your attempts to detect it could be fake. And if you can't detect it, that doesn't mean it's not real. It might just mean it's working perfectly. In other words, a flawless simulation would be indistinguishable from reality by design. Now, you might be thinking, okay, interesting, but what does this have to do with my actual life? More than you might think, because the simulation argument isn't just about whether we live in the matrix. It's about how we define what's real. Let's zoom in. If you feel joy when your friend texts you, is that feeling less real just because it came from pixels on a screen? If you build a relationship in a video game or a virtual world, does that connection mean less? Is something only real if it's physical? This matters more and more in a digital age. People form entire identities online. They build businesses, friendships, communities, sometimes without ever meeting face to face. Is that fake or just new? The simulation paradox reminds us that our reality is always filtered, whether by biology, culture, or possibly even code. And even if we are in a simulation, so what? Your emotions still feel real. Your relationships still matter. Your actions still have consequences, at least within the world you live in. It's kind of like a dream. When you're dreaming, it feels completely real until you wake up. But while you're inside the dream, it still affects you. You can feel fear, love, pain, relief. If reality is a simulation, it doesn't make your experience meaningless. It just means meaning is relative to the system you're in. There's a deeper layer here too. The simulation theory makes us uncomfortable, not because we fear being fake, but because we fear not being in control. We want to believe our choices matter, that our world is stable, that the ground beneath our feet is real. But this paradox forces us to admit certainty is limited, and even our most trusted assumptions, like this is the real world, might be unprovable. So how do you live with that? By shifting your focus from what reality is to how you act inside it. Whether we're in base reality or a high-res simulation, what still matters is how we treat others, how we find meaning, how we respond to the unknown. That's the paradox. You may never know whether your world is real, but you still have to decide what kind of person you want to be inside it. The Mandela Effect. You remember something clearly, no doubt in your mind. A movie quote, a logo, a childhood fact. It's burned into your memory. You bet money on it. But then someone tells you it never happened. or at least not the way you remember it. You check, they're right, and now you're unsettled. That's the Mandela Effect, the phenomenon where large groups of people remember something that doesn't match the historical record. It's called a paradox, not because it breaks logic, but because it challenges our deepest belief that our memories are reliable. Let's look at the original example. In the 2000s, many people online began sharing the same false memory. They remembered Nelson Mandela dying in a South African prison in the 1980s. They remembered news coverage, speeches, a public funeral. But Mandela didn't die until 2013. He was released, became president, and lived for decades. So how did so many people from different places and backgrounds remember the same wrong thing? That's what makes the Mandela Effect so eerie. It's not just personal forgetfulness, it's collective misremembering. Other famous examples include the Monopoly man never had a monocle. Luke, I am your father is not the actual line in Star Wars. The Berenstain Bears were never spelled Berenstain. Pikachu never had a black tip on his tail. The Fruit of the Loom logo never had a cornucopia. If you're feeling uncomfortable right now, good. That's the paradox doing its job. Because these memories feel real, they're vivid, emotional, confident, and they're wrong. So what's going on? Let's talk about how memory actually works. Most people think of memory like a video recorder. You store the footage, you hit rewind, you replay the scene. But that's not how memory works at all. Memory is reconstructive, not recorded. Every time you remember something, you're rebuilding it from fragments. You fill in gaps, you add details, you blend moments together. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus showed how easy it is to implant false memories. In her studies, people were convinced they'd been lost in a mall as a child, even though it never happened. All it took was a little suggestion and repetition. See, this is called memory distortion. It happens naturally, especially when you mix repetition, time, social reinforcement. And when lots of people share the same distortion, that's the Mandela Effect. But here's what makes it even more disturbing. Your brain doesn't tell you that your memory is wrong. It tells you the opposite. It says, this is true. I remember it clearly. I'm sure of it. And that confidence makes you resistant to correction. In psychology, this is called memory confidence bias. For seekers, the tendency to trust memories that feel vivid, even if they're inaccurate. You see this in eyewitness testimony. People swear they saw something a certain way, but when cross-referenced with video or hard evidence, they're often wrong. And the scariest part, they're not lying. They truly believe it. Now apply this to everyday life. How many arguments have you had where both sides said, I know I'm right? How many times have you felt certain and been proven wrong later? The Mandela Effect is a reminder that feeling sure doesn't equal being accurate. And that's where the paradox really stings. Because if your memory, the thing you trust to define your past, can lie to you without warning, what else might be less solid than you think? But this isn't a reason to panic. It's a reason to stay humble. You don't need perfect memory to live a meaningful life. You just need to know that your brain has blind spots and be willing to question what you know. That means checking your assumptions, listening to other perspectives, being open to correction, and letting go of the idea that remembering of truth, the things we remember with the most confidence, might be the ones we got wrong. And the more certain we feel, the less likely we are to check. Which means if you want to get closer to truth, then start by doubting your own clarity. The Barber Paradox. There's a town with one rule. Every man must be clean-shaven, and there's only one barber. The barber shaves everyone in town, who does not shave himself. So far, so good. But here comes the question, who shaves the barber? If the barber shaves himself, then, by definition, he shouldn't, because he only shaves men who don't shave themselves. But if he doesn't shave himself, then he must, because he shaves everyone who doesn't. So, he can't shave himself, and he can't not shave himself. That's the Barber Paradox, and it's one of the simplest and most mind-bending examples of self-referential contradiction. At first glance, it's almost funny, a riddle, a logic joke. But this paradox actually shakes the foundation of logic itself. It's based on a deeper problem that shows up in math, philosophy, and even computer science. Let's break it down. The Barber Paradox was popularized by Bertrand Russell, a philosopher and mathematician. He created it to expose a flaw in set theory, the basic logic behind how we categorize things. In Russell's original version, the question was, can there be a set of all sets that do not contain themselves? Seems simple, but it falls apart, because if that set does contain itself, it shouldn't. And if it doesn't, then it should. It creates a logical contradiction, a rule that breaks itself. The Barber story is just a more relatable way to show the same idea. It's about what happens when a system tries to define itself using its own rules. Now you might be thinking, okay, but how does this matter in real life? Actually, self-reference problems show up everywhere. Take bureaucracy. Sometimes a government agency has to investigate itself, but if it finds wrongdoing, it's also responsible for punishing itself. It's both the judge and the defendant, and things get murky. Or think about social rules. A group says, we welcome everyone, except people who are intolerant. But then someone argues, aren't you being intolerant of the intolerant? It creates a loop, just like the barber. Or take this example from technology. In programming, a function that calls itself a recursive function has to be carefully controlled. If not, it can cause an infinite loop or crash the system. It's the software version of the barber shaving himself forever. Even in language, we run into it. This sentence is false. If it's true, then it must be false. If it's false, then it must be true. Same structure, same trap, same trap. So, what does this paradox teach us? First, it shows that not all problems can be solved inside the system that created them. Sometimes, the rules themselves are the problem, and you need to step outside them to even see what's going wrong. That's why Russell's paradox led to big changes in the foundations of math and logic. It exposed the need for hierarchies of rules so that self-referential loops could be avoided. Second, it reminds us to watch for circular thinking in our own lives. Ever told yourself, I'm not confident because I always mess things up, and I mess things up because I'm not confident? That's a feedback loop. It feels airtight, but it's just a loop of belief feeding itself. Or, I can't be loved until I love myself, but I can't love myself until someone else loves me. Again, logic collapsing in on itself. The solution: step outside the loop, interrupt the cycle, bring in a new rule, a new input, a new perspective that breaks the paradox. The Barber Paradox isn't about shaving. It's about seeing where systems break when they become too self-involved. That applies to logic, to groups, to beliefs, to people. When a system tries to include or control itself using its own rules, it can collapse under its own logic, and the only way out is to change the frame. The Epimenides Paradox. A man walks into a room and says, everything I say is a lie. At first, it sounds like a normal statement, but think about it for a second. If what he's saying is true, then he's lying, which means the statement is false. But if it's false, then he's telling the truth, which means the statement is true, and now you're stuck. This is the Epimenides Paradox, one of the oldest known logical paradoxes, and a classic example of self-referential contradiction. It's also known as the liar paradox, and its origin traces back to a man named Epimenides of Crete, who supposedly said, all Cretans are liars. If he was a Cretan, and what he said was true, then he too was lying, which would make his statement false. But if it's false, then maybe he was telling the truth. And just like that, logic breaks down. It's a simple loop, but it forces a huge question: can language always describe truth? Or are there cases where meaning collapses under its own weight? Let's make it practical. You've probably heard someone say, I'm lying right now. Ignore everything I say. Don't trust people who say not to trust anyone. They sound clever, but the moment you try to apply logic, the whole thing spirals. And this isn't just a party trick. It affects real things. Let's talk about trust. Imagine someone says, I'm not trustworthy. Do you believe them? If you do, they must be telling the truth. which would mean they are trustworthy, but they said they're not. If you don't believe them, you're assuming they're lying. But that confirms their claim. You're in a loop, a statement that cancels itself out. This kind of paradox shows up in arguments too. Someone says, I'm always wrong. But if they're always wrong, then maybe they're wrong about always being wrong. Again, the system crashes. In logic, this is a classic case of self-reference. But that statement referring to itself in a way that creates contradiction, and it doesn't just confuse humans, it confuses machines. In computer science, these contradictions can cause infinite loops. That's why programming languages and databases need strict rules to prevent functions from breaking themselves. A system that can't detect or handle contradiction will eventually collapse. Now let's take it even deeper into belief systems. A philosophy, religion, or ideology that says this is the only belief system that's right. Anyone who questions it is evil. That kind of statement becomes immune to correction, even if it's wrong. Why? Because it invalidates itself. You can't test it from the inside, and the system won't accept tests from the outside. It becomes a closed loop, a paradox of belief. That's why some of the most dangerous ideas are the ones that claim to be 100% self-validating. They sound powerful, but they create intellectual dead ends. Even in your personal thoughts, this can happen. Think of mental loops like, I'm unlovable, so no one loves me. And because no one loves me, I must be unlovable. I'm not good enough to be happy. And I'm unhappy because I'm not good enough. These aren't just negative thoughts, the logical loops that can't be resolved from the inside. To break them, you have to introduce something external. Evidence, feedback, compassion. Something that interrupts the self-referencing system. That's the real insight behind the Epimenides Paradox. It's not just a language trick. It's a warning about systems that try to explain themselves using only themselves. Whether it's logic, thought, belief, or identity, the self-referencing loop can feel airtight, but be fundamentally unstable. So how do you respond? Not by avoiding complexity, but by spotting when something can't resolve and knowing when to step back and question the whole frame. That's the paradox. A statement that cancels itself out still feels meaningful. But the more you try to prove it, the more you realize it eats itself. The paradox of belief change. You change your mind all the time. You try a new food. You realize you were wrong about a movie. You hear a better idea and think, yeah, that makes sense. No big deal. But when it comes to deep beliefs about politics, religion, values, even identity, changing your mind suddenly feels impossible. You dig in, you argue, you double down, even when the facts don't support you anymore. That's the paradox of belief change. The very process of changing your mind requires you to believe you were wrong, but so that the brains are wired to avoid that at all costs. Why? Because changing your beliefs isn't just about new information, it's about ego, identity, social survival. Let's break it down. You've built your worldview over time. It's based on your culture, your experiences, the people you trust, and it helps you navigate life. So when someone presents an idea that challenges that, even if it's well-reasoned, even if it's true, your brain doesn't just see it as new info. It sees it as a threat. Neuroscience backs this up. Studies using fMRI scans have shown that when people hear arguments that contradict their political beliefs, the brain's threat response system lights up, the same part that activates when you're in danger. To your brain, a challenge to your belief system feels like an attack on you. This leads to something called motivated reasoning, where you don't think to find the truth. You think to defend what you already believe. You cherry-pick facts. You dismiss counter-arguments. You hold yourself together by pushing the truth away. And here's where it gets paradoxical. To change your belief, you have to first believe that your current belief is wrong. But believing you're wrong hurts. It makes you feel ashamed, exposed, weak. So instead of considering the possibility, you protect your position, even if that means staying in the dark. You see this everywhere, in people who defend harmful traditions just because that's how it's always been. In cult members who reject outside evidence to preserve group belonging. In anyone who says, I don't care what the facts say, I know what I believe. It's not that these people are stupid, It's that changing belief costs more than just admitting a mistake. It can mean losing your tribe, your status, your story. This is especially true when beliefs become part of identity. If someone says, I'm a libertarian, or I'm a Christian, or I'm a feminist, then challenging their ideas isn't just about content, it's about who they are. So even if they start to question a specific belief, they may hold on tight, because the alternative feels like losing themselves. Now, here's where the paradox deepens. We admire people who can change their minds. In theory, we call it open-mindedness, growth, maturity. But when it actually happens, we don't always reward it. We say, weren't you just saying the opposite last year? Oh, now you believe that. We treat changed beliefs like inconsistency instead of evolution. So people stay stuck, not because they love being wrong, but because it's safer than being seen as a flip-flopper or a traitor. And yet, belief change is possible. It just rarely comes from debate or data. More often, it comes from emotion, personal experience, human connection. You meet someone from the other side and realize they're not what you thought. You go through something painful that breaks your assumptions. You start reading something that slowly plants a seed, and over time that seed grows. And eventually you say, I don't believe what I used to. But that moment takes courage, because to change a belief is to say, I was wrong, I'm different now. That's not weakness, that's growth, but it requires what most people fear: discomfort, uncertainty, humility. To become wiser, you must first admit that your current thinking might be flawed, but admitting that feels like failure. So we avoid the very step that leads to truth. The paradox of progress. By every measurable standard, life today is better than it's ever been. We live longer, we have more access to food, shelter, medicine, information. Technology automates hard labor. Communication is instant. Opportunities are global. And yet, more people are anxious, depressed, lonely, burned out, and uncertain about the future than ever before. That's the paradox of progress. Life gets objectively better, but people don't necessarily feel better. In fact, the more advanced the world becomes, the more we seem to struggle with meaning, pace, and emotional balance. Let's unpack this. Start with health. Medical technology has reduced child mortality, extended lifespans, and turned deadly diseases into manageable conditions. But rates of mental health disorders are rising, especially among young people. Suicide rates are up in many countries, so are stress-related illnesses, anxiety diagnoses, and antidepressant use. It's not because life is harder, it's because progress doesn't eliminate suffering. It changes the form of it. You're no longer dying from infections, you're crushed by invisible pressures, performance, comparison, isolation. Now look at work. Technology has made work more efficient than ever. You can work from home, automate tasks, analyze data in seconds, but you're also reachable 24/7. Deadlines are constant, and productivity is never enough. You don't clock out. You scroll through work messages in bed. You answer emails while eating. You feel guilty for resting because you could be doing more. Progress created flexibility and erased boundaries. The result? More people are busy but not fulfilled. Now consider connection. We have more ways to connect than ever. Texting, FaceTime, social media, shared files, group chats. You can send a photo to someone across the planet in under a second. And yet, loneliness has become a public health crisis. Why? Because digital connection isn't the same as emotional connection. You see people's highlight reels. You post your best angles, but meaningful relationships, the kind that require time, presence, and vulnerability, are harder to build when everything's mediated through a screen. So the more we connect, the more we feel alone. That's the paradox of progress. What solves one problem often creates another, and our brains weren't built for this. For 99.9% of human history, life was short, hard, and local. You worried about food, weather, predators, and your small group of people. Now, you're bombarded by global news, climate collapse, career competition, political chaos, and you're still expected to stay productive, optimistic, and balanced. It's too much. Psychologists call this evolutionary mismatch. We're using Stone Age brains in a Space Age world, and while progress can create comfort, comfort alone doesn't create meaning. Once survival is handled, the human mind turns to questions like, who am I? What matters? Why do I still feel empty? That's the new struggle, because when everything's possible, you're supposed to be happy, but when you're not, you feel like something's wrong with you, not the system. That's why self-help books explode, why people turn to mindfulness, therapy, minimalism, even conspiracy theories, anything to make sense of the gap between how good things seem and how hollow they feel. So what's the answer? Not to reject progress, but to recognize its limits. Progress solves external problems, food, safety, access, but internal fulfillment doesn't follow automatically. Happiness doesn't come from more options. It comes from clarity, relationships, purpose, boundaries, values. And if we don't actively protect those things, progress will sweep right past them and leave us overwhelmed in its wake. The paradox of productivity. You want to be productive. You want to get things done, check things off, feel accomplished. You want to end the day with proof that your time wasn't wasted. So you plan, you track, you optimize, you stay busy, you stay efficient. But at some point, something shifts. You've been productive, but you don't feel fulfilled. You've been busy, but you don't feel better. That's the paradox of productivity. The more productive you become, the more empty your effort can feel, unless it's tied to purpose. Let's unpack that. In the modern world, productivity has become a measure of worth. You're not just expected to do your job, you're expected to outperform, optimize, crush it. There's pressure to be efficient at home too. Clean faster, cook faster, parent smarter, learn quicker. Even your hobbies are supposed to be monetized, trackable, or useful. Everything becomes a to-do list. Even rest feels like it should be earned. But the more you push, the more the goalposts move. You check off 10 tasks, now you need 12. You get promoted, now you're managing 3 times the workload. You're more productive than ever, and somehow still behind. That's the trap, because productivity without intention becomes motion without meaning. You start mistaking movement for progress, action for impact, effort for value. You work faster, but not necessarily better. You do more, but not what matters. Psychologists call this the busyness effect. It's when people prioritize tasks that are measurable or immediate over ones that are important but abstract. You answer emails before working on a big creative project. You rearrange your desk instead of having a difficult conversation. You focus on short-term wins and postpone deeper work that requires time and discomfort. Productivity becomes a way to feel in control, even if you're avoiding what actually matters. This isn't just a personal issue, it's cultural. We idolize the hustle. We reward overwork. We admire people who are always on, even when they're exhausted. But studies consistently show that overwork doesn't lead to better results. In fact, chronic busyness kills creativity, impairs decision-making, and leads to burnout. You don't think clearly when you're running on fumes. You don't solve problems when you're drowning in small tasks. And you definitely don't feel inspired when your life is reduced to color-coded blocks. So how do you escape the paradox? You ask a different question. Not just what did I do today, but what did it mean? You reconnect productivity to purpose. You stop measuring your day by how many emails you sent, and start asking whether your actions moved you closer to something you care about. This might mean doing less, but with more focus. It might mean slowing down to think, instead of speeding up to perform. It might mean stepping away from your screen, so you can return with an actual thought, not just a reflex. It might mean prioritizing things that don't scale, like deep conversation, rest, reading, or real thinking, because they nourish your ability to do everything else better. And sometimes, it means not doing anything at all. Productivity can make you feel powerful, but without purpose, it just makes you feel tired. The freedom versus meaning paradox. You're told that freedom is the key to happiness. Do what you want, be who you want, go where you want. No rules, no limits, maximum options. And for a while, that feels amazing. No more curfews, no more restrictions. You can travel, switch jobs, swipe on dates, reinvent yourself at any time. But then something strange creeps in, a feeling of drift, of emptiness, of wondering what it's all actually for. That's the freedom versus meaning paradox. The more freedom you have, the harder it becomes to feel that your life has purpose. Because while freedom gives you choice, meaning requires commitment. And those two things don't always coexist easily. Let's break it down. Freedom is about removing constraints, but meaning is often found inside them. A parent may have less freedom, sleepless nights, endless responsibilities, but they often report higher levels of meaning than people with fewer obligations. A teacher, a doctor, a nurse, bound by duty, pressure, service, might not feel free every day, but they often feel that what they do matters, because meaning comes from investing in something larger than yourself, and investment requires sacrifice. The paradox is this: when everything is possible, nothing feels necessary. When every door is open, it's hard to walk through any one of them and shut the rest. But without shutting some doors, you never arrive anywhere. Modern life magnifies this tension. You can change careers, cities, partners, identities, but too many choices can feel like weight, not freedom. This is what philosopher Viktor Frankl warned about. He survived the Holocaust and wrote about how people can endure almost anything if they believe their suffering has meaning. But in a comfortable world with fewer external constraints, people often struggle to create that meaning for themselves. And when you don't have to survive, you have to decide, what do I value? What am I building? What am I willing to commit to, even when it's hard? That's where people get stuck, because freedom feels good in the short term, but meaning pays off in the long term. The problem is, meaning hurts at first. It's uncomfortable. It requires you to say no to other paths. It forces you to face yourself. It often feels boring, or slow, or repetitive. It asks you to do things even when you don't feel like it. But over time, it anchors you. It gives your pain a shape. It gives your joy a home. It creates a narrative that isn't just about freedom, but about direction. The mistake many people make is thinking that freedom is meaning, so they chase freedom. They avoid ties, avoid roots, avoid stillness. But they wake up one day in a perfectly optimized life, and they feel like none of it matters. That's not failure. That's a signal. It means it's time to move from a life of options to a life of intention. So what's the path? You don't have to give up freedom. You just have to choose when to stop chasing more. Choose something to care about, even if it limits you. Choose someone to serve, even if it ties you down. Choose a project, a cause, a role, and pour yourself into it. That's how freedom becomes something useful. You are most free when you know what you're living for, not when you're free to do anything. The convenience paradox. Modern life is built on convenience. You can order food without cooking, message someone without calling, work without commuting, buy without leaving your bed. Every app, every tool, every service promises to make life easier, less friction, less waiting, less effort, and in many ways, it works. Tasks that used to take hours now take seconds. You can automate bills, groceries, even brushing your teeth. The world has never been this comfortable. But here's the twist. The easier life becomes, the harder it is to tolerate discomfort. That's the convenience paradox. The more we eliminate effort, the more fragile we become. Let's unpack that. Convenience removes resistance, and that feels great, until you need to face something that can't be optimized. A difficult conversation, a long-term goal, physical pain, emotional pain, boredom, uncertainty. When your life is full of one-click solutions, even minor obstacles start to feel unbearable. You've trained your brain to expect ease. So when something's hard, your instinct is to escape, not to endure. This is what psychologists refer to as discomfort intolerance, the reduced capacity to sit with anything unpleasant. and it's on the rise. You see it in how people quit activities the moment they feel hard, how we avoid silence with constant noise, how we tap, scroll, skip, and swipe. Not because we're lazy, but because we've lost the muscle for patience and friction. But here's where the paradox deepens. The things that bring long-term fulfillment, pursuit, relationships, health, mastery, purpose, they all require discomfort. There is no shortcut to emotional growth, no hack for resilience, no app for developing grit. And if you've built a life where discomfort is rare, you might find that even moderate challenge feels overwhelming. Here's a real-world example: physical fitness. The more automated your life becomes, elevators, cars, delivery, the more you have to manufacture effort just to stay healthy. You pay for a gym to simulate the labor your ancestors did daily. You track steps because there's no longer any natural reason to walk. Convenience solved the problem of survival, but now you have to go out of your way to simulate resistance. It's the same with mental health. You avoid awkward moments. You ghost instead of confront. You block instead of resolve. You scroll to numb instead of reflect. The result? Low resilience, high reactivity, and a deep sense of disconnection, not just from others, but from yourself. So what's the answer? Not to reject convenience. You don't need to live like it's 1850, but you do need to reintroduce intentional effort. Take the stairs, cook a meal from scratch, or have that difficult conversation in person. Sit with boredom for 10 minutes. Instead of grabbing your phone, do one thing the hard way, just to remember that you can. Because the goal isn't to suffer. It's to stay strong enough to handle reality when it doesn't bend. And life won't always bend. Illness, loss, rejection, failure, none of those have a shortcut. If your entire life is built around ease, you'll be unprepared for the moments that matter most. Convenience should support your strength. It does not replace it. The paradox of planning. You plan to feel in control, to prepare, to reduce uncertainty, to avoid chaos. You make a schedule. You write your goals. You imagine the future, map it out, break it down. And for a while, planning feels powerful. It gives you a sense of clarity, like you're holding the reins. You know where you're going. You're ready. But then reality shows up, but unexpected delays. People change their minds. You lose motivation. Something breaks. The perfect plan gets wrecked by something you didn't see coming. And suddenly, your planning feels useless. You feel anxious, thrown off, defeated. That's the paradox of planning. The more you plan, the more you expect things to go according to plan, which makes you even more upset when they don't. Let's unpack that. Planning is supposed to reduce stress, but the more rigid your plan becomes, the more it creates a false sense of control. And when things don't follow your script, which they rarely do, you feel like you've failed. But you didn't fail. You just confused a plan with a guarantee. That's the trap. Plans are tools, not promises. They help you prepare, not predict. But we often fall in love with the illusion that planning equals certainty. And so when uncertainty shows up, which it always will, we feel blindsided. Psychologists call this the planning fallacy, our tendency to underestimate how much time, complexity, and chaos life actually involves. You plan for the best-case scenario. You forget that real life includes traffic, distractions, bad moods, sick days, tech failures, and people who don't do what they said they would. And so the plan collapses, and with it, your sense of order. But here's the deeper problem. Sometimes we use planning to avoid feeling things. We plan obsessively to avoid anxiety. We build out elaborate schedules to avoid uncertainty. We over-engineer our day so we don't have to sit with discomfort or ambiguity. And when something breaks that plan, those emotions come rushing in. You don't just feel off schedule, you feel out of control. That's why some people give up planning altogether. They say, what's the point? Life is too random. But that's not the answer either. Because without any plan, you drift. You react. You lose structure. You forget your goals. So, what's the solution? You plan, but with flexibility built in. You hold your goals firmly, but hold your methods loosely. You expect obstacles. You leave buffer time. You create priorities, not just checklists. And most importantly, you separate the plan from your identity. Just because your plan fell apart doesn't mean you did. Some of the best outcomes in life come from plans that broke and forced you to adapt. Think about it. The job you didn't get that led to something better. The detour that introduced you to someone important. The failure that forced you to level up. Your plan didn't account for it, but life made room for something richer. So you keep planning, not to avoid chaos, but to meet it with grace.